Hey, la 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 la. Ooh wee, ooh wee, la 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 la. Boom boom boom, boom 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 boom. Ba da ba da boom. Ooh wee, la 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 la. Yo, we here like we never left. You dig? The books all around the joint. I mean, like a tunnel, like a maze, like a method of, creating an optical illusion, but it's also helping you to stay in tune. And we got the Mozart in the background. Psst, classical music for working, studying, and brain power. So this episode is dedicated to brain power. Hopefully, your brain is powered. And don't forget to try out Brain Power Juice, sold to you by the Vanderbilt Alexander brand. Not quite, but you never know. We might have to add that to the mix. All of these things that have again meant to hurt me, I suspect, I've just been using them to empower myself and to try to make the world a better place. That's why on Facebook it says, use the things they, quote unquote, use to scare you to make the world a better place. So we might have to start marketing some things as it relates to the cognitive resilience aspect of all this. You feel me? Because we cognitively have overcome a lot, and you can too. I think I got a little formula. I'm not saying that it's the formula for everyone, but it's a formula to make it past their expected breaking point. Ain't no breaking point. We only break till we get to the point. Our point. We determine that. All right, let me stop rambling, y'all. We here. I'm not going to take too much of your time. Thank you for checking out another episode of Let's Learn, presented to you by Vanderbilt Alexander. Now, in this episode, we are actually joined in with the Hip Hop Legal, which is another one of our brands. Let me pull up my picture here. That way I can provide some clarity. But I hope your Tuesday, it is a Tuesday, isn't it? For me, it's Wednesday, here in Guangzhou, China. Let's see. All right, the Safari Club and BCCI Bank. Check it out. You dig? We got, of course, him, Hip Hop Legal, Hip Hop Lawyers, in the hands. Service is, when I do these things, it's a part of the service component of content creation. Because we just giving the game for free, straight up. Because there's all kinds of games, you know what I'm saying? But the biggest game is to not be fooled. So the first step, let's just provide the surface level understanding, and then we can put other things behind paywalls and whatnot. But this knowledge is out there. It's just been forgotten to a certain extent, and time has sort of moved past it. But we want to use it as a point of a point that needs to have an asterisk next to it, because these are historical moments that have impacted society in one way or another. As you know, we've been looking at it from the economic and financial lens, and here we are once again looking at an aspect of capitalistic economics that talks about how historically there's always been this cat and mouse game with various entities playing the subterfuge game to try to avoid having to follow the rules that have been set in place for everyone. And historically, sometimes various entities have been able to get through. They were able to hit the lick, if you know where I'm coming from. The Safari Club and the BCCI bank situation is an exact example of that. These entities were able to position themselves to hit a lick, and they were able to do it for a little minute. And once you start to find out who's connected to this stuff, it'll blow your mind, because you're like, yo, it's always been like a double tiered system, you feel me, or various tiers to the joint. And I ain't hating. Again, get it how you live, you know what I'm saying? But it's just funny how, they had us on a different path, chasing after riches, copying the hip hop approach to things, the drug dealer approach to things. I'm talking about, and then making us follow rules, if you will, that straight up they knew was just petty, man. That whole domain, that game and that area were little beans, little small, inconsequential situations. In the grand scheme, when it comes to the prison industrial complex and the fact that hip hop was definitely something that grew out of the misery and then also got co-opted a little bit later down the line, but it did come out of that same crack dealer, drug dealer mentality that rose out the mid to late 80s going into the 90s and further. But so the whole time, we're fixated on that, and this is what's happening behind the scenes, you feel me? And this is big boy and big girl stuff we about to get into right here, you dig? But nah, they was able to play this game the way that they played it, and for the most part they got off, you know what I'm saying, as it goes. But it's just one of those historical moments that we can't lose sight of, or that we can't forget, because it's important in the grand scheme of what I'm trying to accomplish. To be honest with you, I want to try to pursue every bit of understanding that I can of this system before I start to go into international possibilities. And that might be the only way to do it, because again, if they've been able to circumvent democracy and capitalism thus far, why would you ever want to position yourself with folks like that, or the sort of situation that puts you into that place? And again, I've literally reached out. If I'm wrong, I'm sure I would have gotten notice at this point. But so it just seems for me to be a factor of, well, while mistakes were made, and while it is a complicated moment in history, and maybe others are going through, who knows, but again, there's no need to stifle, in my opinion, you shouldn't be able to stifle innovation just because you got a better plan, or you want to sort of keep the status quo in place. And you name the metric, the method in which I can prove that that's the case, I have them. So again, it's either it's willfully, this is being done by design, and it's been done historically by design, or it's the biggest anomaly you've ever heard of in terms of just the system not operating in the way that we've all believed that it operated, or that it operates at. We all thought capitalism was all about innovation. You become innovative, you find your lane, and as long as you follow the rules as they sort of require it, you should be in a good place. But it would appear that it's not that simple, and especially when, again, they don't have certain safeguards in place. They have to keep you within a sandbox. It would feel like, in simple terms, it would appear that this system, for some people, they have to keep them within a sandbox. They can't just let them sort of operate with autonomy without knowing what they got going on. And again, historically, it would appear that there's a demographic that tends to fall into that category every time. Despite, it doesn't matter how many instances of the Safari Club and BCCI Bank and financial misdoings and things like that that occurred throughout history, the Enrons of the world, the recession. It doesn't matter how many times those things happen, which again, you look at the people that usually cause those things, they're not the demographic that, again, you would sort of put into that criminal class, right? But no matter how many times that happens, the focus is always, no, we need to make sure these dudes, like this guy on the screen, does not have the autonomy to roam and to be innovative in this system that we've created. You dig? So that's what it seems like. Whoops, I'm sorry, guys. That's what it seems like. If I'm wrong, again, tell me in the comments. I welcome all the smoke. But nah, we started at this point last time when we were looking at the algorithm brought me here. Let me say that. The algorithm brought me here, and I'm happy to be here. But it was based off of us last time looking at the sovereign wealth fund landscape out there. We learned about sovereign wealth funds. And then somehow here I am stumbling upon the Safari Club and BCCI and the scandal that took place with both of those entities. All right. But let's start off first and foremost with the Safari Club. The Safari Club was a covert alliance of intelligence services formed in 1976 that ran clandestine operations around Africa at a time when the United States Congress had limited the power of the CIA after years of abuses, and when Portugal was dismantling its colonial empire in Africa. Interesting. Its formal members were pre-revolutionary Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and France. The group maintained informal connections with the United States, South Africa, Rhodesia, and Israel. The group executed a successful military intervention, in Zaire in response to an invasion from Angola. It also provided arms to Somalia during the Ogaden War. It organized secret diplomacy relating to anti-communism in Africa, and has been credited with initiating the process resulting in the 1979 Egypt-Israel peace treaty. Interesting. Okay. Now let me go over some of the things that are in blue that we read, just to get us a better understanding. But the Ogden War, for example, is also known as the Ethio-Somali War, was a military conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, fought from July 1977 to March 1978 over control of the sovereignty of the Ogaden region. Somalia launched an invasion in support of the Western Somali Liberation Front, WSLF insurgency. All right. Invasion from Angola. The conflict, Shaba 1 was a conflict in Zaire's Katanga province lasting from March 8th to May 26, 1977. The conflict began when the Front of the National Liberation of the Congo, that's the FNLC, a group of about 2,000 Katangan Congolese soldiers who were veterans of the Congo crisis, the Angolan War, so on and so forth. But that's that. Let me see. The Egypt-Israeli peace treaty, that has to do, a quick snippet here. The Egypt-Israel peace treaty was signed in Washington, D.C. On March 26, 1979, following the 1978 Camp David Accords. The Egypt-Israel treaty was signed by Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt, and Meacham Begin, Prime Minister of Israel, and witnessed by Jimmy Carter. Let me see. Let's say there, Jimmy Carter, President. Okay, so that's that. The organization, let's get back into the Safari Club. Alexandre de Manishes, who is also known as Count Alexandre de Manishes, was a French military officer, a director of the SDECE, French External Intelligence Services, special advisor to U.S. President Ronald Reagan, and a member of the Academy of Morocco. Okay? But he initiated the pact with messages to the 4 other countries and to newly independent Algeria, which declined to participate. The original charter was signed in 1976 by leaders and intelligence directors from the 5 countries: France, Alexandre de Manishes, director of the SDECE; Saudi Arabia, Kamal Adham, director of the GIP, and the GIP is the General Intelligence Presidency, is the primary intelligence agency of Saudi Arabia. Okay. Egypt, General Kamal Hassan Ali, who is he? Let's see. He was an Egyptian politician and military hero. As far as Kamal Adhan, he was a Saudi businessman and the director of the General of Al-Mukhabarat Al-Amal from 1965 to 1979. He served as a royal counselor to both King Faisal and King Khalid. Okay. Director of Mukhabarat, and again, that's the Mukhabarat. Once again, the General Intelligence Service, often referred to as the Mukhabarat, is an Egyptian intelligence agency and a secret police force responsible for providing national security intelligence, both domestically and internationally. The GIS is part of the Egyptian intelligence. Okay, let's see. Now we have in Morocco, General Ahmed Dilimi. Ahmed Dilimi was a Moroccan general under the rule of Hassan II after General Mohammed Oufkir's 1972 assassination. He became Hassan's number 2, or rather Hassan II's right-hand man. He led the Western Sahara War and played a major role in the Angolan Civil War. He was promoted to general. Stop there. And Mr. Dilimi was the director of the DGED, that is the General Directorate of Studies and Documentation, which is a foreign intelligence agency of Morocco under authority of the Administration for National Defense. It is officially tasked with maintaining national security and the safety of national institutions. And in Iran, we have General Nematollah Nasiri. Nematollah Nasiri was an Iranian military officer who served as the director of SAVAK, that's SAVAK, the Iranian intelligence agency during the rule of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. He was also the ambassador of Iran to Pakistan. Nasiri was among the 438 individuals arrested and, it looks like it says executed there, but it got cut off. Okay. But again, he was the director of the SAVAK, again, the Bureau of Intelligence and Security of the State, shortened to SAVAK, or S.A.V.A.K. And again, this was the secret police of the Imperial State of Iran. It was established in Tehran in 1957 by national security law. and continued to operate until the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Okay, back to the article. The charter begins, quote, recent years in Angola and other parts of Africa have demonstrated the continent's role as a theater for revolutionary wars, prompted and conducted by the Soviet Union, which utilizes individuals or organizations sympathetic to or controlled by Marxist ideology. The group's purpose was therefore to oppose Soviet influence by supporting anti-communists. The charter also says that the group intends to be, quote, global in conception, close quote. Its formation has been attributed to interlocking interests of the countries involved, which were already cooperating to some degree, alongside ideological pursuit of global anti-communism. These included the more concrete goals of military strategy and economic interest. Examples include international mining operations and investments in apartheid South Africa's Transvaal Development Company. Okay, infrastructure. Quote, the club sat on 91 acres of magnificent landscape with Mount Kenya as a backdrop. These were mountain streams, rose gardens, waterfalls flowing into quiet pools. Peacocks, storks, ibexes, and exotic birds strolled about. Ronald Kessler, the richest man in the world. The story of Adan Khashoggi, 1986. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Let me say this. When I read this and I saw the Khashoggi, I thought to myself, yo, Jamal Khashoggi, the dude that got murdered, God rest his soul, the journalist actually that got apparently brutally murdered in I want to say a consulate. I think it was a Saudi consulate, some designated area like that was supposed to be, you would think safe, but they went in there, it looks like, and they showed video, dudes going in, and apparently they, excuse the grotesqueness of this, but they chopped the dude up and put him in a suitcase. But I know that name, and I'm sure you've heard it too. So I'm like, Khashoggi. So I was like, man, how many Khashoggi families could there be out there in the world? But I'm like, let's see if there's a connection. But anyway, the algorithm showed me that there is indeed a connection. I'll show you that. I'll let you know in a second. But let's get back to the article. The Safari Club, takes its name, reportedly, de Montchel's idea. And again, we remember that was the French gentleman. So he apparently came up with the name, the Safari Club. But after the exclusive resort in Kenya, where the group first met in 1976, the club was operated by a Saudi arms dealer, Adnan Khashoggi, also friend of the Adhams. Now, a real quick snippet of Adnan Khashoggi. Adnan Khashoggi was a Saudi businessman and arms dealer known for his business dealings, extensive geopolitical influence, and opulent lifestyle, which earned him the moniker, quote, the Great Gatsby of the Middle East, close quote, during his peak in the early 1980s. And his net worth, I think, was a couple bill. He ended up his whole time running through his racket, made him a couple billy. And of course he's from that era, and I think there was this era of dudes that did grimy stuff to get the money. And they enjoyed it thoroughly, but these were really strange individuals in terms of their love for opulence. again, you can't take these things with you. And I get it, while you're here, you gotta enjoy it. But sometimes you think to yourself, like, yo, how much fun is fun in, wherever he's at in his final days? You hope that he had peace and, could say to himself, man, it was worth it. Because if not, and having your hand in different things where you supplying guns, these kinds of business deals, it's the low down worse, you know what I mean? Like, because, you know what you involved in, you know what these things are going to be used for. And so you think to yourself, in an age of technology being at our disposal and, just being able to do so many different things that are positive, these dudes, I think they got it wrong. If you look at the whole story of us being here on this planet, even though you left and your scoreboard, if you will, was sitting at a couple $1 billion, what did you do to get that? You know what I mean? Like, that's really, I think, what separates the real ones, the real ones, versus the others. Now listen, a broke MFer gonna tell you, nah, it's just about having it. But if you've ever had it, you know that many people could have it, and some give it away faster than others. You know what I mean? But many people could have it, but it's about what you did to get it, and when you have it, what's being done with it. So I just wanted to say that. But let me click on Adnan Khashoggi real quick, just to, because this is what I did. And again, it brought me to Jamal, but I'll show you the connection right now. But again, Adnan Khashoggi was born on July 25th, 1935, and he died on June 6, 2017. And again, he was a Saudi businessman and arms dealer, known for his business dealings, extensive geopolitical influence, and opulent lifestyle, yada, yada, yada. But yeah, he checked out with about $4 billion amassed through his pivotal role as an intermediary between Western defense companies and the Saudi government. Khashoggi was the founder of the Triad International Holding Company, and these dudes were very methodical in terms of how they created their entities and placed different things. This is, I can understand, because historically, if this has been the template that guys have used to be able to avoid accountability, and also not follow the rules as it's set out, in terms of paying taxes and all of that, you just think about the things that they go through, and they make it hard really for entities or individuals out there that have plans in terms of how they structure their corporate umbrella. And it might be on the up and up, completely legit, and nothing about it is meant to, be a form of subterfuge or cause problems, or avoid liability. But that's just what you did, right? That's just your thing. You had your reason for setting up your corporations the way that you did. But you got to think, though, these guys here, they had another thing in mind in terms of why they set up their corporate umbrella the way that they did. But let's keep going. So he had the Triad International Holding Corp, which was a Swiss multinational private investment corporation that was owned by Adnan Khashoggi. Its investments included many notable businesses and properties throughout the world, yada, yada, yada. Okay? Including luxury hotels, oil refineries, and real estate. Known for hosting lavish parties attended by celebrities and politicians, Khashoggi's lifestyle made him a media fixture, and inspired popular culture, even influencing songs by Queen and appearing in shows like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Which, like I said, man, you read this, you're like, oh, that's cool. But yo, It's just a different metric. You get to a place where you start to develop different metrics based off of understanding how this journey goes. You feel me? When you get to a certain point, and I feel I'm kind of there now, right? Where I've exposed a lot of these things, and I'm like, yo, whoever's around and whoever I can look at that can look me in the eye and then stand behind what they're doing, and for me to not see that it's a facade, that's going to be few and far between. Because there's something about not, like, once you get your hands involved in dirt, you can't look people in the eyes, unless you're a socio or psychopath, but or suffer from narcissistic personality disorder or different disorders out there. But by and large, you really shouldn't be able to, right? When you got your hands, or when your hands are still in the cookie jar, you still taking cookies out low key. You know what I mean? You ain't looking people in the eyes. You're getting your cookies, you're putting them in your pocket, you're moving out the way, right? And there's something to be said about when you get to this stage and you peep who's around you, and then you peep those that aren't doing it that way. That is just another level of saluting when you recognize that you're in that space. And then you try to maintain that, you know what I'm saying? You try to stay as legitimate as possible. And, like I said, I think it's becoming easier to do that. And because of that, it does create a problem for the other side, which always, what they do is effectively create honeypots. There's this idea, I've sort of noticed this, that there are just so many honeypots, literally just holes that you're gonna go in. It might be sweet, you get that honey, you start eating, but then you end up getting stuck in there. And that's when they swoop in, and then they point you out and say you're the bad guy. And like I said, if you look a certain way, if the eye test, if you can't get past the eye test and you look a certain way, you make it as easy as possible for them to say you're the bad guy. So that's why you got to really weigh all these things out when you sort of look at these scenarios. But anyway, let me see. So, and this is his family, early life. But I went over here and looked over and saw the relatives. Samira, Sohir, Dodi. Oh, Dodi Fayed. That's actually the, and see, he was very rich. So the money came from them, but these boys, and girls did their thing too. Samira, I think she got married to another Egyptian businessman, Muhammad Al Fayed. Oh, okay. And I think Muhammad was the father of Dodi. Okay. And Dodi died with Princess Diana. Now that's where it gets a little ill. I'm like, yo, damn, what an interesting set of connections here. And then, of course, Jamal Khashoggi, as I mentioned before. So I haven't gotten into that rabbit hole, and I'm not. But I'm just putting that out there. If your algorithm has led you here, then maybe it can lead you down that path. Or maybe there's a connection there. Because it's funny, man. I tell you, when you're like in tune with the universe, the level of synchronicity that occurs and how it sort of all connects, it just becomes like this magical, serendipitous, almost dream-like situation. You know what I mean? And you're like, wow, look at that. Like, sometimes you didn't even plan it out yet, but you're just going. You're going. And that's what, I've talked about this, that the algorithm is effort. The effort that you put in truly is the algorithm, yeah. And this is proof once again, but that's Adnan Khashoggi, and we did confirm he was related to Jamal Khashoggi. But let's get back to the Safari Club, okay? So, back to the article. The original charter establishes that an operations center would be built by 1st of September 1976 in Cairo. The group made its headquarters there, and its organization included a secretariat, a planning wing, and an operations wing. Meetings were also held in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt. The group made large purchases, that is, of real estate and secure communications. The creation of the Safari Club, the creation of the Safari Club coincided with the consolidation of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Now, if you guys remember when we went over the hedge funds, look at this interesting connection. I remember reading about the BCCI. And of course, when you see BCC, you know, your head automatically goes to the gutter. Or that's BB. Anyway, so you think, oh, and you know, at least for me, I'm like, all right, well, that's usually associated with my demographic. No, I'm just playing. But I remember seeing the BCC, and I'm like, oh snap, all right. And I remember looking at it, and they had, I think, a couple of hedge funds. I forget which ones, but they had some hedge funds connected to them. And I don't know if they're still around anymore, but I definitely remember seeing that. So I'm like, oh, that's dope, all right. But apparently the BCC served to launder money, particularly for Saudi Arabia and the United States, whose director in 1976, George H.W. Bush, had a personal account. So George Bush had a personal account in the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Okay. Quote, the Safari Club needed a network of banks to finance its intelligence operations. With the official blessings of George Bush as the head of the CIA, Adham transformed a small Pakistani merchant bank, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, into a worldwide money laundering machine, buying banks around the world in order to create the biggest clandestine money network in history. And again, let me just say this. When I read these things, sometimes I get to the place of the crypto bros and those guys in that space, the DeFi dudes. Yo, they're really on to something, man. When you know this history, you gotta say to yourself, how can you hate on the other path? You know why? Listen, because this has been, for the most part, regulated. And maybe the other side hasn't been to a certain extent. I get both sides of it, you feel me? And it's going to be more difficult to regulate the crypto and the DeFi sort of spaces. But because these sort of things took place with BCCI Bank and George H.W. Bush having an account there, and them boys being able to run roughshod, you know, above the rules that have been prescribed, that have been allocated for following, you know, anti-money laundering rules, then you got an issue here where it's literally, you know, which are you going to just make a certain segment follow the rules and others don't have to? That has been easier historically, and it's not going to be that easy in these times that we're in now. But anyway, they contrived with Bush and other intelligence service heads a plan that seemed too good to be true. The bank would solicit the business of every major terrorist, rebel, and underground organization in the world. The invaluable intelligence thus gained would be discreetly distributed to friends of the BCCI. United States involvement. The United States was not a formal member of the group, but was involved to some degree, particularly through its Central Intelligence Agency and Henry Kissinger. who is credited with the American strategy, of supporting the Safari Club implicitly, allowing it to fulfill American objectives by proxy. I've mentioned that term before. By proxy, which is an armed conflict where at least one of the belligerents are directed or supported by an external third party. All right. Let's see. Without risking direct responsibility. The function became particularly important after the U.S. Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973 and the Clark Amendment, which, hovering over it, tells us that this was an amendment to the U.S. Arms Export Control Act of 1976, named for its sponsor, Senator Dick Clark, not the other one, but from Iowa, a Democrat. The amendment barred aid to private groups engaged in military and paramilitary, that is, operations in Angola. And the Clark Amendment in 1976, reacting against covert military actions orchestrated within the government's executive branch. An important factor in the nature of the U.S. involvement concerned charging domestic perceptions, or rather that's changing domestic perceptions of the CIA and the government. The Rockefeller Commission, sorry guys. The Rockefeller Commission, by the way, was a United States commission, was ordained by President Gerald Ford in 1975 to investigate the activities of the Central Intelligence Agency and other intelligence agencies within the United States. All right? And the Church Committee. Now, the Church Committee was a U.S. Senate Select Committee in 1975 that investigated abuses by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, National Security Agency, NSA, Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and the Internal Service Revenue, IRS. So that's the Church Committee. But had recently launched investigations that revealed decades of illegal operations by the CIA and the FBI. The Watergate scandal directed media attention at these secret operations and served as a proximate cause for these ongoing investigations. President Jimmy Carter discussed public concerns over secrecy in his campaign, and when he took office in January of 1977, he attempted to reduce the scope of covert CIA operations. In a 2002 speech at Georgetown University, Prince Turki Al-Faisal, who is also commonly known as Turki bin Faisal Al Saud, who was a Saudi prince and former government official who served as the head of the Saudi Arabia's General Intelligence Presidency from 1979 to 2001. He is a grandson of Saudi's founder, King Abdulaziz. Of the GIP, described the situation like so. So this is how Prince Turki Al-Faisal described the situation. In 1976, after the Watergate matters took place here, your intelligence community was literally tied up by Congress. It could not do anything. It could not send spies. It could not write reports. And it could not pay money. In order to compensate for that, A group of countries got together in the hope of fighting communism and established what was called the Safari Club. The Safari Club included France, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and Iran. The principal aim of this club was that we would share information with each other and help each other in countering Soviet influence worldwide, and especially in Africa. As the Safari Club was beginning operations, former CIA Director Richard Helms, and Richard Helms was an American government official and diplomat who served as Director of Central Intelligence, that is DCI, from 1966 to 1973. Helms began intelligence work with the Office of Strategic Services during World War I, following the 1947 creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, is what I imagine it says, and Agent Theodore Shackley. Theodore Shackley, also known as Theodore George Ted Shackley Jr., was an American CIA officer involved in many important and controversial CIA operations during the 1960s and 1970s. He is one of the most decorated CIA officers due to his, quote, light hair and mysterious ways, close quote. Shackley was known to his colleagues as the blonde something. Okay? But they were under scrutiny from Congress and feared that new covert operations could be quickly exposed. Peter Dale Scott, who was a Canadian poet, academic, and former diplomat, a son of the Canadian poet and constitutional lawyer F.R. Scott, and painter Marion Dale Scott, he is best known for his critiques of deep politics and American foreign policy since the era of the Vietnam War. But Mr. Scott has classified the Safari Club as part of the quote-unquote second CIA, an extension of the organization's reach, maintained by an autonomous group of key agents. Thus, even as Carter's new director, or rather CIA director, Stanfield Turner, and Stanfield Turner was an admiral in the United States Navy who served as president of the Naval War College from 1972 through 1974, commander of the United States Second Fleet 1974 through 1975, and Supreme Allied Commander, NATO, Southern Europe, 1975 through 1977, and was director of blank. But Mr. Turner attempted to limit the scope of the agency's operations. Shackley, his deputy, Thomas Klein, who was an American covert operations officer for the Central Intelligence Agency and a prominent figure in the Iran-Contra affair, and Agent Edwin P. Wilson, who was a former CIA and Office of Naval Intelligence officer who was convicted in 1983 of illegally selling weapons to Libya. It was later found that the United States Department of Justice had relied on a false affidavit when prosecuting Wilson. As a result, Wilson's convictions were overturned. secretly maintained their connections with the Safari Club and the BCCI. Undercover operations with congressional oversight. The Safari Club used an informal division of labor in conducting its global operations. Saudi Arabia provided money, France provided high-end technology, and Egypt and Morocco supplied weapons and troops. The Safari Club typically coordinated with American and Israeli intelligence agencies. Debut: Shaba Province of Zaire. The Safari Club's first action came in March through April of 1977 in response to the Shaba I conflict in Zaire, after a call for supporters was made in the interest of protecting the French and Belgian mining operations in the country. The Safari Club answered and came to the aid of Zaire, led by the Western-backed and anti-communist Mobutu. And Mobutu is actually Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Nebendugu, Negenbendu Waza Banga. Okay, also known by his initials MSS, who was a Congolese politician and military officer who was the first and only president of Zaire from 1971 to 1977. All right, let's see. In repelling an invasion by the Front for the National Liberation of the Congo, the FNLC, France airlifted Moroccan and Egyptian troops into Shaba Province and successfully repelled the attackers. Belgium and the United States also provided material support. The Shaba conflict served as a front to the Angolan Civil War and also helped to defend French and Belgian mining interests in the Congo. The Safari Club ultimately provided $5 million in assistance for Jonas Savimbi's National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. That is the UNITA, which is the second largest political party in Angola. Founded in 1966, UNITA fought alongside the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola and the National Liberation Front of Angola, FNLA, in the Angolan War. All right, and Jonas Savimbi actually was an Angolan revolutionary, politician, and rebel military leader who founded and led the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA. And this was one of several groups which waged guerrilla war against Portugal. Interesting. Bear with me. Let me get some water. All right. The group helped to mediate talks between Egypt and Israel, leading to Sadat's visit to Jerusalem in 1977, the Camp David Accords in 1978, the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty in 1979. This process began with a Moroccan member of the Safari Club personally transforming a letter from Yitzhak Rabin to Sadat and reportedly warning him of a Libyan assassination plot. This message was followed by secret talks in Morocco supervised by King Hassan II. Real quick, Camp David Accords, that is the parapolitical agreements signed by Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Prime Minister Mechem Begin on September 17, 1978, following 12 days of secret negotiations at Camp David. Okay, and then we also have the peace treaty, we mentioned that, and then Yitzhak Rabin. He was an Israeli politician, statesman, and general. He was the Prime Minister of Israel, serving 2 terms in office, 1974 through 1977, and from 1992 until his assassination in 1995. He is the first Prime Minister to have been born in mandatory Palestine. Interesting. Okay, King Hassan II, he was the King of Morocco from 1961 until his death in 1999. A member of the Alawi dynasty, he was the eldest son of King Mohammed V and second wife, Princess Alba bint Tahar. Okay, with Israeli General Moshe Dayan, who was an Israeli military leader and politician, as commander of the Jerusalem Front in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, chief of the General Staff of the Israel Defense Forces from 1953 to 1958. During the 1956 Sinai War, and as defense minister during the Six-Day War in 1967. And here we see Mossad, that is Mossad. This is the Institute for Intelligence and Special Operations, popularly known as Mossad. It is the national intelligence agency of the State of Israel. It is one of the main entities in the Israeli intelligence community, along with Amman and Shin Bet. Alright? Director Yitzhak Hofi. Yitzhak Hofi was a member of the Palmash, IDF general, chief of the Northern Command, Israel, and director of the Mossad. An Egyptian intelligence agent, Hassan Talmi. Talmi was born in 1924, passed away in 2009, was an Egyptian, that is, deputy prime minister during Anwar Sadat's presidency. He also held various posts during the presidency of Gamal Abdel Nasser, that's Gamal Abdel Nasser, including ambassador of Egypt to Austria and director general of the Arab Socialist Union. Immediately after CIA Director Stansfield Turner told an Israeli delegation that the CIA would no longer provide special favors to Israel, Shackley, who remained active in the Safari Club, contacted Mossad and presented himself as their CIA contact. Ethiopia and Somalia. The Safari Club backed Somalia in the 1977 through 1978 Ogaden War after Cuba and the USSR sided with Ethiopia. This conflict erupted when Somalia attempted to gain control over the ethnically Somali Ogaden region of Ethiopia. Prior to the war, the USSR had supported both states militarily. After failing to negotiate a ceasefire, the USSR intervened to defend Ethiopia. The Soviet-backed Ethiopian forces, supported by more than 10,000 troops from Cuba, more than 1,000 military advisors, and about $1 billion worth of Soviet armaments, defeated the Somali army and threatened to counterattack. The Safari Club approached Somali leader Syed Barre. And Syed Barre was a Somali military officer, politician, and revolutionary who served as the third president of Somalia from October 21, 1969 to January 26, 1991, and offered arms in exchange for repudiating the Soviet Union. Barre agreed. Saudi Arabia paid Egypt $75 million for its older Soviet weapons. Iran supplied old weapons, reportedly including M48 tanks from the U.S. The events of Somalia brought unique divergence between the official policies of the U.S. and the Safari Club. Carter, perturbed by Somali's unexpected aggressiveness, decided against publicly backing Somalia. And the Shah of Iran was forced to deliver the message from Carter that, quote, "You Somalis are threatening to upset the balance of power," close quote. But on August 22nd, 1980, Carter's Department of State announced a broad plan for military development in Somalia, including construction of a base, as well as economic and military aid to the Somali National Army. And the Somali National Army are the ground forces component of the Somali Armed Forces. This policy would continue into the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration was the tenure of President Ronald Reagan as the 40th President of the United States began with his first inauguration on January 20th, 1981, and ended on January 20th, 1989. Reagan, a Republican from California, took office following his landslide victory over Democratic incumbent President Jimmy Carter. Okay? Now, arming and funding the Afghan Mujahideen. Safari Club members, the BCCI, and the United States cooperated in arming and funding the Afghan Mujahideen, which is these were Islamic militant groups that fought against the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan and the Soviet Union during the Soviet-Afghan War and subsequent First Afghan Civil War. All right, let's see, where am I at? I'm sorry, folks. Okay, to oppose the Soviet Union. The core of this plan was an agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia to match each other in funding Afghan resistance to the USSR. Like military support for Somalia, this policy began in 1980 and continued into the Reagan administration. Further developments. The Safari Club could not continue as it was when the 1978 through 1979 Iranian Revolution neutralized the Shah as an ally. However, arrangements between the remaining powers continued on the same course. William Casey, Ronald Reagan's campaign manager, succeeded Turner as director of the CIA. And William Casey, by the way, was an American lawyer who was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1981 to 1987. In his capacity, he oversaw the entire United States intelligence community and personally directed the Central Intelligence Agency throughout, it would appear, much of the Ronald Reagan's tenure throughout the 80s. Where was I at? Okay, Casey took personal responsibility for maintaining contacts with Saudi intelligence, meeting monthly with Kamal Adham, and then Prince Turki Al Faisal. Some of the same actors were later connected to the Iran-Contra affair, and Saudi Arabia provided the funds for the attempted assassination of Syed Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah. And let's see, as it relates to Syed Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah, on 8th March 1985, a car bomb exploded between 9 and 45 Melt from the house of Shia cleric Syed Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah in Beirut, Lebanon, in a failed assassination attempt by a Lebanese counterterrorism unit linked to the Central Intelligence Agency. Okay, The existence of the Safari Club was discovered by Egyptian journalist Mohammed Hussein Haikal, who was permitted to review documents confiscated during the Iranian Revolution. So that's that as it relates to a quick breakdown of the Safari Club. And you also saw the mention of BCCI. Now, let me say this, fair use. Please go and subscribe to, on YouTube, their page is called Chapo Trap House. That is C as in Charlie, HAPOTRAP, Trap House, HOUSE. All right. Now they have an episode, which is episode 762, and it's called The Safari Club, featuring Brendan James and Noah Colwyn. That is KULWIN. This was recorded on August 29th of 2023. Here's me giving them an upvote. Here's me subscribing to their page. And here, I'm playing their content. Check out how they present this whole thing. And yo, I'm gonna jump in every now and again, but again, fair use, educational purposes. I don't want the song. Let me let that song get by. I don't want the song to give me a copyright. I don't own the rights to that music.
Felix and I are joined today by, it's my favorite time of year, it's Blowback Season 4. We are joined today by the co-hosts and creators of Blowback, Brendan James and Noah Colwyn. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Hey homies.
Hey guys.
Alright, Brendan, Noah, Blowback Season 4 just came out. You know, we gotta get you on. This is probably, I listened to the first 3 episodes. This is probably like your season that is most ambitious in scope. And the story you've chosen to tell, the history that you're digging into this season, is sort of like the genesis of the term blowback, at least in its most, a popular conception of like 9/11. So let me ask you, like, why Afghanistan? What drew you to this topic this time, and what did you begin to discover as you started reading?
Now listen. There's a September 11th, 2001 connection to this too. I didn't add that part, but check this out.
Researching this season.
Yeah, it's definitely the most on the nose understanding of blowback, probably is at least for our generation. The term itself was coined by a ex-CIA guy, Chalmers Johnson, years ago. But as we've found every season, sometimes it's a punchy title. For the show. Sometimes we're talking about blowback, sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're talking about something that is said to be blowback, but is a little bit more complicated. And then this is, I think that really kind of uber example, and we wanted to dive into it because really of the withdrawal in 2021. And it wouldn't just be about Afghanistan, this endless war, but it would be about a somewhat sort of beginning, middle of, and end now. At least for the time being, of American involvement. And there's other reasons. I mean, we like to jump around. I like to jump around. We got to go to the 1980s. We've never really gotten to cover that decade before in the show. And we got to kind of follow all these colorful characters through a real 40-year saga, which, as you say, is like a longer period of time than we've ever tried to cover before.
I can share with our listeners that if you are fans of the works of Hideo Kojima, you will not be disappointed by this season. It is, and the little audio samples and drops you guys throw in there is incredible. But I guess in the first episode, you lay out some themes that are developed over the course of this season. And I guess the first one I want to talk about is the connection between political Islam and jihad and Western intelligence services, because I know this we don't need to get into it sounds conspiratorial to say, but like, would fundamentalist Islam as a political movement in Afghanistan or really anywhere else in the Middle East? I know Afghanistan is in the Middle East, but like, could you lay out like the connections between political radical Islam and Western intelligence?
Yes. Well, I think it would be a stretch to say that it wouldn't exist. Period, end of sentence. There's a long, history up until that moment in the 1980s or late 70s of political Islam growing in different parts of the world. I mean, you already had the Muslim Brotherhood existing for many decades, and writings that sort of changed and grew and became more of a outright opposition to modernity and all of that. Sayyid Qutb and some stuff that I'm sure some listeners are aware of. But as far as like a really contemporary version of political Islam, whose foot soldiers or commanders are still with us today, that was really, I think you could argue that was cooked up in that key period. And, Noah and I know Noah could talk about the Safari Club was the nexus of Western and regional intelligence agencies that organized that new strain, or rather channeled that new strain of political Islam. And Noah, you could probably speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you could think of like at the same time that the process that we call globalization was unfolding, one of the sort of new information streams that was going along and traveling around the world in that time was like political Islam, in particular sort of radical political Islam. And one of the sort of, I guess, superhighways, if you will, like that on which it traveled was this kind of route between China and Pakistan and the United States and Africa and even Southeast Asia. And the Safari Club in the 1970s was at the sort of insistence of a French intelligence official, Alexandre de Marange. What they did was I believe it was named for a literal there's a place, in other words. But
you can actually visit the Safari Club.
I mean, I don't know if you can. I maybe they shoot you on sight. I don't know.
Is it like a big room with like zebra heads and stuff like that?
I think of it as kind of like the Ben Gazzara's house on the inside at the end of Roadhouse.
Roadhouse, yeah, exactly.
Where it's just like, and there's like a big fat guy like waiting to get smothered by a big bear statue.
Who are the members of the Safari Club?
So it's Saudi Arabia. It's Saudi Arabia, the United States. General Z is Pakistan, right, Brendan? Or is precedes?
It's a loose confederation. Sometimes people are showing up, sometimes they're not. Saddam Hussein was said to be on the periphery of it. But yeah,
as were Israel and South Africa, for example.
I feel like
Now, don't let that escape you. Saddam Hussein. All right. I'm gonna say it again. Saddam Hussein. It's kind of heavy, huh?
I feel like Saddam showing up there, that's sort of like, an obligatory social thing, like going to your friend's one-man show at a DIY venue.
Saddam, I got a good venue for my my quintet. My dance and my cycle. I'd really appreciate it if you could come.
But most of all, the Shah of Iran was our boy in the Middle East at that time, and was, while a secular dictator for the most part, he was just as interested in dicing it up with radical Islam in his neighbors. And the Shah was really before Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, he was our heaviest hitter in Afghanistan, because there was an increasingly progressive and eventually outright communist government in Afghanistan that was not looking for the same goals and the same allies that the Shah was. And so this club, which sounds very conspiratorial, but it's just admitted to by all these guys years later when they're like talking at Georgetown or doing a C-SPAN thing. And it's all those years ago. It's safe to say it now. It was really pulling the strings all along, and then by the time you get this Marxist revolution in Afghanistan in the late 70s, which precipitates the Soviet invasion, these guys are really starting to recruit the warlords and the mujahideen that we know and have loved ever since.
And it's also worth thinking about how, like, the Shah, because he was our biggest boy, like, for example, I think like about a third of all American arms sales abroad in the 1970s went to the Shah. Once the Shah fell, all of those weapons went into the hands of an enemy, and so we had a new strategic rival that had to be combated. So Afghanistan, from a strategic point of view from the U.S., from where Zbigniew Brzezinski and later William Casey and so forth were sitting, they thought, like, holy like, this is a new force we have to counter. And what's more, in 1979, it was not just in Iran where you had this sort of wave of religious revolution kind of sweeping. In Saudi Arabia, for example, religious extremists took over the Kaaba, and they were only dispelled with the assistance of French special forces. They had to mop up the blood of the place. So there was a real, I think, which just all to say that, like, political Islam was also viewed in that moment as like a really powerful and ascendant force, and so like a weapon that could be deployed in Afghanistan as it was.
Yeah, I will note that with the taking over of the Grand Mosque of the seizure by French commandos, there is a lot of funny historical tidbits and rumors around that. But it was less a like coherent and broad form of political Islam, and more of like it was sort of like a bunch of bumpkins who they had a cousin who had declared himself the Mahdi. It wasn't as linked to any grand transnational movement, but it certainly did, cause fears within the kingdom. And the of course funny repeated historical rumor of that is the French commandos that were sent in to seize it back for the Saudis, that they were forced to convert to Islam to enter it, and then converted back to Catholicism after the mission was done. Though people have said that that's made up. I choose to believe it.
I believe that 100%.
Yeah.
That's way cooler than the Bin Laden's cover story.
Yeah. I guess the point of our season is there were a lot of bumpkins, and there were those who were more organized, but everyone could get something out of the jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and that is indeed where I think a hitherto or an unprecedented level of collaboration began. And to your point, Will, we try to make it an angle of this season, which I'm getting in a large part from a scholar named Timothy Mitchell, who wrote a great book called Carbon Democracy. And he has a chapter called Mick Jihad. And Mick Jihad kind of is this...
Since we're here, let's look it up. Carbon, that is, democracy. Let's see. Timothy Mitchell, okay. All right. Political Power in the Age of Oil. Released on November 7th, 2011. Fossil Fuels and Political Institutions, okay. And he says, what chapter is that?
Choose to believe it.
I believe that 100%.
Yeah.
That's way cooler than the Bin Laden's cover story.
And they mentioned Bin Laden there, by the way, if you didn't catch that.
I guess the point of our season is there were a lot of bumpkins, and there were those who were more organized, but everyone could get something out of the jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and that is indeed where I think a hitherto or an unprecedented level of collaboration began. And to your point, Will, we try to make it an angle of this season, which I'm getting in a large part from a scholar named Timothy Mitchell, who wrote a great book called Carbon Democracy. And he has a chapter called Mick Jihad. And Mick Jihad kind of...
Mick Jihad. Okay.
There's this, basic idea that you don't need to think about the big secular capitalism and the reactionary militant Islam as separate as we all are kind of told to, by either side. They do a lot more collabs than they've ever wanted to let on.
Well, a point you make in the first episode, and I think like an easy shorthand for thinking about this, is that with few notable exceptions, the more U.S.-backed a state in the Islamic world is, the more U.S. backed it is, the more Islamic the nature of the state is in its tenor and character.
Typically. And we point out, obviously, there's exceptions. I mean, Iran would be an obvious
Iran, yeah.
example.
Mhm.
However, before that, it was one of the most closely aligned states in the region with the U.S., and it was the Shah. But even then, we have cooperated with Iran in many times and places. Most famously, Iran-Contra was when the Reagan administration got caught with their hands in the cookie jar. But they were also open to going after the Taliban with us once we flipped on the Taliban, or they flipped on us, whichever you want to say. And we're offering search and rescue and full support for the Northern Alliance. They've been funding the anti-Taliban warlords a lot longer than we had. So, or rather at that moment. So yeah, but in general, you got the Gulf monarchies, you got the Islamic, states in the Middle East and Asia are typically American allies, and it was the kind of Baathists in Syria and Iraq, more the Syrians than the Iraqis. It was the secular PLO. Movements like this were not very friendly to the Americans at all. So we made nice with everyone. You can go back to the Saudis in the 1930s, when we inked a deal with them. It's just sort of an undercovered thing.
And we chose Sunni over Shia, which is a subject that I cover in a bonus interview with Cy Hirsch, because he wrote a really kind of seminal article on this about how like America sort of, the global war on terror could be viewed as part of how we took this kind of policy even more global than it already was. But, because, Iran, like, the main reason that it is not, or not the main reason, but like a major factor in why it is not a strategic friend of ours, despite its, religiosity, is the fact that it's a Shia state. And if you look at a lot of the different Gulf states, Bahrain, for example, that's it's a Sunni Arab minority that runs the state where you have a lot of, Shia minorities. And that's a dynamic that can be replicated and is found, in a lot of places in the Arab world. So there is also a degree to which, that distinction, I guess, just shouldn't be ignored.
Yeah, and even in Gulf nations that have a sizable Sunni majority, there's still a very significant Shia population. The last accounting in Saudi Arabia, which I believe was something like 30 years ago, and so it could be very different now, was that they were 30% Shia. And yeah, one of the interesting advantages, and you see it a ton in Afghanistan, it was not the first time that we saw this policy from Gulf states, but probably the formalization of it. With these hyper-religious U.S. allies, the advantage is you can, especially in a multipolar world, you can send your population of extremely religious, or sometimes recent converts, or not that religious, angry young men, to whatever regional conflict against an enemy that you have no means of fighting through conventional warfare or even conventional intelligence. And that became...
Yo, y'all heard that? We can't miss out at these points. You gotta take note. History is the best because it helps you predict the future or understand the present. The present, that is. Let me back that up a little bit.
Extremely religious, or sometimes recent converts, or not that religious, angry young men, to whatever regional conflict against an enemy that you have no means of fighting through conventional warfare or even conventional intelligence. And that became... It was incredibly useful to the Gulf monarchs. And
now let me say this. I feel like a lot of what's been taking place, it's been almost, again, if it's not for me per se, it's like they trying to create angry young men. Or at least put them on ice. Start categorizing them. And if you have this war machine that is hungry, you feel me? They know about the trillions of dollars that's on deck for that particular part of capitalism. So they need to start organizing, figuring out who's who. different reasons, national security and whatnot. But anyway, check this out.
Probably even more useful to us.
Well, especially us because George H.W. Bush was CIA director in the middle of the 70s when, after the Church Committee and Pike hearings, there was a real attempt to curtail the CIA's power and scope. And essentially what Bush tried to do, and I think successfully did to a large degree, was offshore a lot of work that he wasn't supposed to be caught doing at that moment, or that the CIA.
So again, we've mentioned this, but you saw the connection there. But Herbert Walker, rest in peace, George Bush. I'll say that just because he passed away, but different people have different opinions about him. But we'll say rest in peace to anybody that's not here. You feel me? So rest in peace to George H.W. Bush. Hey, listen, while he was here, he went hard. That man did it all. You know what I'm saying? In terms of leadership, in terms of fighting for this country, all of that. So you got to respect that. And then his son also became president. You do a lot of these things and you're like, yo, I've accomplished what I set out to do. You could say that, this is a full life. But then again, you look at the ending a lot of times, and I got this from an adult. I'll just say this real quick, but I got this from someone that I respect. I always listen to older folks, but they said, if no matter what it is that you've done throughout the journey, if you end up in a predicament when you're like wheelchair bound, you can't move around on your own, to a certain extent, you don't even want to live anymore. You're like, man, this ain't it. No matter what it is you've accomplished. So imagine that. Now, I connect that to the notion of we all put our pants on the same, ain't no one better than no one else. Like, it helps me to have that sense of humility no matter what throughout the journey, you know what I mean? But, and so, would you rather have a scenario where you've done all those things and you end up in that predicament, and then maybe your son, I'll just leave that alone. But it's just, life is very interesting as we watch it unfold, or we actively participate in it unfolding. But again, it's just always good to maintain that perspective. Anyway, let's go back.
CIA guys weren't supposed to be caught doing. And that was, for with regard to Afghanistan, eventually a much closer relationship with the Saudi intelligence, and then eventually the Pakistani intelligence as well. But the standing relationship between the Bush family and several families in Saudi Arabia meant that all Bush had to do initially was just call up, the Saudi intelligence head, and they both had, dealings with similar banks and similar investors, and say, hey, we need to be laying low right now, but we're happy to share a portfolio with you guys. And that got us started with a whole lot of stuff that follows us into 9/11 and beyond.
And you could also think of, we focus on the show on, for example, BCCI, the shadow.
I definitely want to talk about that in a second.
Yeah, but it's also, I think a good way of helping it is like BCCI was like the sort of underbelly sliver of, like, again, this process where it's like, they're inking deals, like the U.S. and the Saudis are inking deals through BCCI. They're also inking deals through David Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank. And there are a lot, this is a process of, like, this is the seamy underside of a friendship that was, just a really torrid fucking romance, really, that began in that time.
Well, Noah, since you brought it up, let's talk BCCI. It's like, when we were plotting out Poppy Part 3 in Houston, I realized, like, the third part of the Poppy series was very much, because we were in Houston, it's about this nexus of, like, intelligence, the petroleum, and banking and finance. So, like, that's what the city of Houston is. But BCCI in general is one of the most astonishing. It is the 2001 monolith of all, like, the emperor of all. It's a Pandora's box of, like, everything evil that has ever happened in the last 40 or 50 years. Could you just, like, give me just a brief overview on what was BCCI, who was involved in it, and what did it do?
So, BCCI was a bank created by a Pakistani guy. It's important to say that it wasn't created in Pakistan because there's a lot that remains kind of murky about where exactly it was hatched. But the guy who created it was named Aga Hassan Abidi. And he was this kind of like strange, like it would be fair to call him like a guru figure. You can look it up on Wikipedia. He's got some weird speeches. And the bank was set up at the with the assistance of Saudi and Central Intelligence, and I guess the then incipient ISI, to effectively serve as an international clearinghouse for all sorts of different operations that these intelligence agencies were running. It would later emerge that supposed left-wing terrorists, although probably ops like Abu Nidal, were run out of BCCI, but also it's where the Afghan Mujahideen got a lot of their money. And I believe it was it Adnan Khashoggi who staked it or who just ran it? I forget.
Khashoggi, I don't think you ran it, but this is another expression of the Safari Club. It's like the financial,
Yes.
expression of them. So there's drug running, there's this sort of, fees for assassinations. Really, every criminal act you could think of, as you guys have probably covered, was run through BCCI. But one of the things that was the Mujahideen.
And also, BCCI's customer base was like, this was during a time when,
Again, the criminal acts. Like I said, when you really reflect on it, I don't care what nobody say, what was your ambition if you thought about being involved in criminality, becoming like El Chapo, right? And it's funny, this page is called Chapo Trap House, but like in the hood, we put these people up on a pedestal, but really there's dudes behind them that's even bigger, right? Now imagine these dudes when you talk about controlling conflicts, selling arms, you dig? I'm talking about nation fighting, wars, you know what I mean? That's what these dudes was involved in. So it's always levels to the game, but it also goes to show you that there's really no level to being vile, to like, if you're wrong, you're wrong, you dig? And that's why I've always said it's best to try to see if you could be the best at being good. Why not be if you want to pursue something, pursue being good, and try to be the best at being good versus trying to be the best at being bad. Because you're always going to be mid-level at bad. And when you look at what some of these situations and these people touching a couple Billy in the 80s, 90s, setting conflicts into motion. These boys really had their hand, in the fire or in the cookie jar. And they might be in a fire now, depending on your views of what happens in the afterlife, right? But again, is it worth it? I don't think so, because look at where we're at now. And hey, maybe they didn't have that option back then as far as finding, just more productive ways of using their energy. It's all about how you apply your energy, the energy that you have that's embedded within you. How do you apply it? Apply it towards something productive and something positive. You got a better chance of having a wholly, thoroughly fulfilling life in that manner.
For example, the number of Pakistani immigrants in London were, swelling, and in England were too. So BCCI had this really large depositor base that it was able to tap from, these like growing immigrant networks. And so when the bank went tits up, it was a lot of those people who ended up being really fucked. Because the bank was not actually chartered. It was chartered in, I believe...
excuse the profanity, by the way. Let me say a couple things. Fair use. Also, excuse the profanity. We can't control that, but we'll just brush it off, right? We're more focused on the message, the pertinent components of the conversation.
If Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands, so it had this like dual registration. It was like they exploited the fact that there was nobody at all looking at their books.
Yeah, they tried to make it look like a third world, development bank.
Yes.
It was supposed to present itself as people would say now, as a woke bank, but was in fact a very shadowy institution.
In fact, it was a based bank.
Let me say this real quick. We've seen that, or it goes to show you, look, using little slick ways to stand behind the concept of being woke or being active, or you obfuscate by pretending like you're here to help. You on some, we're going to rebuild the third world. That's what we're about, excuse me. That's our mission. But then the whole time you're just using it to launder money. And the thing is, every time that happens, it just hurts anyone that every time, as time moves on, people shy away from even approaching those kinds of things because you just don't know. So it sort of has another ability to make people stop assisting, stop being as helpful, stop being as empathetic. And that's where I really say shame on these individuals, because you won't do the crime. Why do something like that? You get to that point where you're destroying the potential for good to be done in the future after your time. You create something that's supposed to be legitimate on paper, supposed to represent one thing, which is giving back, and he mentioned wokeness, whatever it is, right? But it's supposed to be something that's helpful to helping society progress, being progressive. But then the whole time, that's not the case. Now, I've also noticed when these things happen, it's by design too, because there are certain political elements that find it to be a good thing to, trick people as far as not knowing what's woke and what's not. Again, it's just another, there are so many levels to this sophisticated system of white supremacy that, like I said, a lot of times you get entities that they hide behind these things. They know good and well what's happening, but they sit back and don't say nothing so that, they political buddies will come through. Let's create a Black Lives Matter, but let's do some things with that Black Lives Matter that's gonna turn people off from it, so that collectively, people be like, we ain't really on that, even if they want to be helpful. So you accomplish that objective, but you're also doing your dirt. That's where, it's really grimy when people approach things in that manner, in my opinion. But go ahead.
It was not woke.
That's the B in BCCI, is for base.
Based credit and commerce.
This out in the Muslim world, they have a term called anti-wokia. It ranges back to the time of Muhammad.
Pretty much in the Saudi time.
Another huge part of this story is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And before I get into this, I would like to talk about a few of the sort of American pop cultural understandings of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. They come in two movies that jump to mind. The first of which you talked about in the first episode, of course, Rambo 3. Yes. And you dropped the absolute bombshell that this film is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters is 100% cap. And yes. I got hooked deep by that one. It was too good
we
stuff
both
to
did.
believe.
We all did, because I think in our book
it's a dedication of our book. Yeah.
I know, and we try to make a joke about it, but in doing more research, it's a hoax. It was just someone who really nailed the early Photoshop, I guess. But we also say the reason it goes so far in our internet culture, in our pop culture trivia, is because it is spiritually true. that we all kind of feel like that happened, which just didn't happen in that particular case.
you don't need to have the words "this film is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan" to understand that is 1,000% the message of Rambo 3.
Oh yeah, and I rewatched it, and it is it incorporates a lot of myths at the time that we go into in the show. I mean, there's a lot of sort of typical like trademark blowback style stuff in there where we accused the Soviets of doing. Well, first of all, to your point,
Chemical weapons, chemical weapons.
Chemical weapons, we built a case, totally debunked, never been proven. We say that they were, I mean, we exaggerated a lot of stuff about body counts and things like this. But also, we, most of all, and the point we make in our first episode is, it was really a way to both change the subject from Vietnam, which had only really just concluded a couple years before 79.
But also flip the myth of Vietnam itself. Yeah.
Correct. And there's some ways where it's like the Soviet Union's Vietnam, of course. I mean, they got bogged down in the quagmire. But, I mean, that's not the only thing that characterizes the Vietnam conflict. That's a very punchy and marketable way.
Now, I like that, so let me look it up. I know what quagmire is, but let's see. Bogged down. Bogged down in the quagmire. I like that, sir. Means to be deeply struck or entangled in a difficult, complex, or unpleasant situation from which it's hard to escape. Bogged down in the quagmire. Hey, we learn on various different levels. But now we're gonna put that aside. Bogged down in the quagmire.
Of putting this in headlines in America and across the world over and over again. But it is also a way to project everything we did onto the Soviets from the get-go, that they did not a lot of times, in fact, do. But in other ways, it was not a lot like Vietnam. I mean, there was no grand theory of dominoes and what needed to be done in Asia or the Middle East to communize or to decapitalize the grand chessboard like we were thinking in Vietnam. It was a very reluctant invasion, in fact.
And if you remember Rambo 2, First Blood Part 2, Rambo, I mean, like, that was the movie where we get to win the Vietnam War. You know, he rescues the POWs, but the POWs are being held by a direct intervention of the Soviet Red Army. And, like, they have the big attack helicopters, he blows that up at the end. But, like you said, like, the screenwriters and Hollywood or whatever, and, you know, the general military-industrial entertainment complex was projecting onto the Vietnamese exactly what we would have done in their position.
The military-industrial entertainment complex. Let's make note of that, too. Military, M-I-L-I-T-A-R, military-industrial entertainment. Military-industrial entertainment complex. Wow. Okay, there's actually a Wikipedia and some information on that. I mean, I've thought about it before, and I know that movies, sometimes they'll have to get like approval from, depending on the agency that gives them the go-ahead, whether it be Mission Impossible, what was the other one? Well, you know, there have been several throughout history, but even the ones with Tom Cruise, obviously Mission Impossible, but the one when he was Barry Seal, that was interesting. I think, you know, certain things have to be approved for these shows to get the go-ahead, or these movies to get the go-ahead, and the funding a lot of times.
Which is directly
It's really funny. There's a line in Rambo 3 where Troutman says to the kind of grim-faced Soviet commissar, who's, you know, the avatar for the USSR, and he's like,
"But you do not seem to realize I'm providing a way out for us both."
You expect sympathy? You started this damn war, now you have to deal with it.
And we will. It is just a matter of time before we achieve a complete victory.
You know there won't be a victory. Every day your war machines lose ground to a bunch of poorly armed, poorly equipped freedom fighters. The fact is that you underestimated your competition. If you'd studied your history, you'd know that these people have never given up to anyone. They'd rather die than be slaves to an invading army. You can't defeat a people like that. We tried. We already had our Vietnam. Now you're gonna have yours.
We already had our Vietnam. Now you're gonna have yours. But it's like Vietnam has become it's like a proper noun of just meaning things like the war that is either the Vietnam War, the literal Vietnam War, or the Afghanistan War, or whatever. It doesn't even mean a country anymore. It's like a shorthand by then, and that's what we try to apply.
Yeah, I mean, it's insane to say this about, I mean, really Vietnam in the first place, but like the attitude of the national security state and the military establishment seems to be like it's unfair for another country to support whoever we're fighting.
Yeah.
Okay, the second more contemporary film that I think like covers the same history you're talking about is the Mike Nichols, Aaron Sorkin film Charlie Wilson's War. How would you rate the history of portraying that movie, and in particular the characters like Texas Congressman Charlie Wilson, played by Tom Hanks, and the Greek Gus, the CIA Afghanistan hand, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman? How do you guys, like, having done this whole season, did you rewatch Charlie Wilson's War, or like what do you make of that film and what it says about a more contemporary 21st century sort of post-war on terror understanding of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and our intervention in that conflict?
I chose not to rewatch it because life's too short. But I think that there's probably a lot of good stuff in there that is true about Charlie Wilson himself and Gus Stavrakoutos, Greek Gus, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, in a great performance by Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Fantastic.
I think if I recall, there is a lot of the propaganda that, you know, if it's a good movie, I don't really care. We were just talking about Rambo 3. It's still a fun movie. But I think it definitely has less of an excuse to take on propaganda about what the war was really about all those years later than Rambo 3 did in the thick of it. And I think it was still upholding a lot of kind of bromides of American, you know, we had to do this. But then again, I haven't seen it.
I didn't rewatch it, but like the movie does not really deal at all with like how brutal the Mujahideen were. Like it really kind of just like lionizes them completely. And then the other thing that it does, it makes like the Julia Roberts character, Joanne Herring, and Tom Hanks. It's not that like it sanitizes or makes them more likable. It's just that like it doesn't really show you. I mean, I guess that is sanitizing. Like, it doesn't show you the fact that like they like love General Zia of Pakistan so much to the point that they were like willing to apologize for his butchery at their cocktail party.
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't remember that in the movie, but there's a great bit in the book where Joanne Herring, Julia Roberts' character, is holding a big, a big swanky party to fundraise basically and to do deals about this new project of the Mujahideen. And Zia is there as an honored guest, and she sort of clinks her glass so everyone will listen up. She said, before I introduce our guest, I just want to make very clear he did not murder the previous president of Pakistan, which of course he did in a military coup. And all of her bougie friends were sort of pulling their collars a little bit, thinking like, oh, I don't know if we should have come to this party. But it all paid up.
He's sort of a Rodney Dangerfield figure from Caddyshack. One of the I mean, I despise that fucking movie, and even though it is a great Philip Seymour Hoffman performance, I still see it as like a waste of very finite time. We have a finite time we have left for him. But there's a lot of things I hate about the movie. My least favorite fucking thing is at the end they try to reconcile the aftermath of all this, and probably the worst set of lines Aaron Sorkin has ever written. Well, after they win, basically, Charlie Wilson goes, "Wait a minute, we're not sticking around to build schools to make them to make them less Muslim."
Well, and then it's
what was the point of this?
Well, then we did build the schools, and the guy who built all the schools was just like running a fraud. The Greg Mortensen, the 3 cups of tea guy.
Well, I'll say this: I don't know if it was Mike Nichols, and it might have been Tom Hanks. We went on that Hassan show, and I said this, but apparently at the end, the plan was to have it show September 11th and the planes hitting the towers. That was like in the script. It was Nichols' intention. but either Tom Hanks or someone else was like, "No, this comes out in Christmas. Let's not."
Tom Hanks' CIA handler said, "Sorry, we can't do that."
Well, I mean, like, another interesting detail that the movie excluded was Representative Charlie Wilson's.
Yo, y'all heard that? Is that how handlers work? Anyway.
Prodigious cocaine habit.
Is that not in the
And you have a
movie?
very, yeah, that's not in the movie at all. It
Wait,
shows
what?
him catting around, but he's not blowing rails and like
No
He was
way.
known. He was known
Yeah.
as Cocaine
You have a
Charlie.
very funny audio clip from like C-SPAN where some angry constituent's just like, "Buddy, you got a cocaine problem," and he's just like, "Oh," and he goes, Charlie Wilson says, "I've dealt with that problem about 5 times now."
No. He said the guy is like saying, you know, like we should have a more diplomatic policy towards the Soviets. And then this guy says, well, and then Charlie Wilson says, well, I'm glad you're not in my district. And the guy says, oh, well, I wish I was. Hey, you still have a cocaine problem? And then Charlie Wilson goes, cleared that.
He goes, I say, and he starts just foghorn leghorning out live on TV. But it's a great clip. But yeah, he was Cocaine Charlie, and he also did a hit and run. I don't know if that's in the movie.
No, it's not.
He did a hit. This is amazing. I thought all this like salacious stuff was at least part of it, but he hit someone in D.C. and then literally was like rushing to the airport so that the D.C. or Virginia police couldn't take him in, and he got on a plane to Pakistan to go do like another fact-finding mission. So he literally escaped.
Yeah, that all of his like debauchery is boiled down to just like, this guy loves drinking champagne in a hot tub. And maybe he get.
Yo, there you go. That's another example right there. You know, and listen, I'm all for, like, I love Nerds, the movie. I love that culture of like 1980s, early 90s, MTV, spring break, party vibe. Yo, I love it. You dig? But, yo, these dudes was wild, man. I mean, and it was around that era. And like I said, a lot of times I'm mad because I'm like, yo, you know, you don't let the whole society run amok like that. You feel me? You decide to really put down on black people, black males in particular, to stop them from doing that. And I'm not saying anyone should be involved in a hit and run or anything like that. But this dude went, Charlie Wilson, you know, he went, did a hit and run, and you know, they're all laughing about it. I know it's all tongue in cheek, but he did the hit and run and then cleared it to Pakistan. At certain levels, these boys move like the world is theirs. It's their oyster. Hey, you know, you can't hate because that's just a game, but you know, you could talk about it a little bit. Nah, Charlie Wilson, it's kind of like what was his name? Kennedy in Chappaquiddick or Chappaquiddick. This was Ted, actually. He passed away. You know, we'll let sleeping dogs lie, but that came up on my algorithm a good while back too. You know, just different stories, man, throughout the history of politicians and white ones in particular that be wilding out, but them boys be, I mean, getting away with it. Anyway.
He gets too much pussy.
Yep. Okay. That makes sense. And then it's because I heard he liked the movie, and if you really represented his life, we have some choice quotes even in the first episode. He is, first of all, I think he's awesome. Let me just be clear. Like all of that is awesome. But
yeah, I endorse all of that.
But yeah, then of course the dark side are all the deals he's making. Because though he appeared a buffoon, he was actually a pretty good natural politician behind the scenes. And as he put it, he elevated the cause of the Mujahideen, who were raping their enemies and their prisoners, who were.
I mean, you have an
dealing
amazing
drugs.
quote about from Greek Gus, where he returned, shall we say, a rather vivid description of you know, like our allies in Afghanistan.
He loves the term cornholing, and he had reason to use it a lot in his memoir or his to his biographer. And yeah, I mean it is, we go into like the real unvarnished portrait of the Mujahideen, and we talk about the Soviet brutality as well. And there's a lot like Vietnam, I guess, in that sense, that Soviet troops were just
Yeah, I mean, and
really
also that like a lot of the violence from the Soviets was just like, I mean, it was bombing, and like if you want to like look at the actual like Adam Two's, you can just Google it. He did a pretty good like some of just how much ordnance they dropped. Like that's the real similarity with Vietnam, but that's not what people talk about when they mention it.
And I just throw in just that the the Vietnamese resistance, like Ho Chi Minh was not invented and paid by the Soviet Union or China. And you can see that, there's a whole thing you can go into here, but that's a big whiff on the metaphor, because after the war was over, Vietnam built its own state, and of course, reunified, and it has its problems like any developing country, but has become like a member of nations and all this other stuff. The warlords we were backing in Afghanistan immediately tried to kill all of each other and blow up Kabul, which was the only place untouched by, or one of the few places untouched by the war in the 80s. And then, of course, became Taliban and Al-Qaeda adjacent and all this other stuff. So there's another real important difference in the Vietnam metaphor that people like to make.
Another fascinating bit of history that you guys delve into is the events preceding the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which I don't think a lot of people understand, and the history of the Afghanistan Communist Party, and also like its rather surprising connections to the CIA.
So essentially, there was a split between the like on the eve of the Soviet invasion. What was really going on was that there was a split, and in one faction you had there was a more moderate wing, and then there was a more radical wing, and the more radical wing was behind this guy Amin.
Hafizul Amin was the head of became eventually the head of the Communist Party of Afghanistan, but for a while he was the number two to a guy named Taraki, who he eventually killed. He was associated with Columbia University because of programs that the Americans would kind of try to, make nice with promising young students from developing nations. However, the issue is that the programs he was a part of, and the Afghan sort of student society he was a part of while in Columbia, were later revealed by Ramparts magazine and others to be fronts for the CIA. So there's an odd cloud of suspicion around this guy, who does go back to Afghanistan. He had been to Columbia twice for 2 different degrees, and then was always the one pushing a more violent and more, all-consuming and, as you could say, like extreme line. Whether he was a part of the CIA has never really been confirmed, whether he was an asset, a working asset. We found a really interesting passage in a memoir that a friend of the show, Marissa Shepard, had to translate, in which a Soviet general says, here's what I saw in the records where Amin was defending himself from his fellow Afghan communists about being part of the CIA. Whether this was like something where he was playing the CIA or he was, using everybody at the same time, we'll never know, but we try to mention other, there have been instances where leaders of radical communist or, extremist parties abroad are not necessarily free of any association with our own intelligence agency. You have Pol Pot and Zbigniew Brzezinski, as a matter of fact, were in contact throughout the same period. And a Mexican president was a CIA asset.
Portillo.
Yeah, Portillo. So, whether Amin is one of those guys, it's an interesting point of intrigue in the show. But he eventually invites both America and the Islamists and the Soviets to kind of do favors for him all at once. And the Soviets' favor was to come in and give him backup against some of his enemies. But what the Soviets do is to themselves say, this guy's chopping everybody's head off, and we just need to go in there and get rid of him because he's as much of the problem as the Islamists. So
and they kill him almost immediately. After intervening to support his communist government.
Yeah, they pulled a switcheroo there.
Yeah.
They definitely pulled a switcheroo there.
Okay, you just brought him up, and I definitely wanted to get to this guy. because he's one of the people most responsible for all of this blowback and is one of the most underrated evil figures in American foreign policy. I'm of course talking about the Carter administration, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Could you talk a little bit about this guy and like what led him to adopt the most like?
Hey yo, what a dope name, Zbigniew. Zbigniew. Yeah, I don't know why his name, from the first time I heard it, it stuck out. And as I've been getting into some of these topics, he pops up too. So it's funny how that happens, but let's go.
Get Carter and the U.S. government to adopt the most maximally hawkish position vis-a-vis Russia and Afghanistan.
Yeah, so I think that the sort of easy way to think about how somebody like Brzezinski comes to direct policy is that he was, sort of tarred and viewed as a lib, because he was a socially liberal guy, but he was always this hardline anti-communist. And the Carter administration was, it came into power and had been elected, and their strategic vision had really been, sort of oriented around like this, domestic response to Watergate. And so that meant that in some respects that like, Brzezinski leading the National Security Council was pretty empowered to engage in some, extensive fun and games as far as policy was concerned to check the Soviet Union. And Brzezinski, as a sort of measure of course, believed that the Soviet Union's downfall was the overriding necessity for all American policy. Like it was everything he believed, everything he understood. And some people we've interviewed, Paul Fitzgerald, Elizabeth Gould, the way they put it is is that Brzezinski views this as like it's a throwback to like the 19th century as like a means of like countering Imperial Russia, and he constructed a policy in Afghanistan or helped to along those lines in the 1970s.
Yeah, Brzezinski could never get over not only the history between Russia and Poland in his time, but like hundreds of years earlier.
Yeah.
And he was just absolutely dedicated, fanatical, not even so much against communism, but against what he saw as modern day Russian imperialism, whatever you want to say. And he is unapologetic, or was unapologetic about using militant Islam to achieve that goal. I found a funny clip where he's being asked by, and I played in the show, later in the show, where he's being asked by an interviewer, who's from that region, you've said that the Taliban were sort of small potatoes compared to taking down the evil empire. Do you still feel that way? And he's unrepentant. He says, oh, imagine if the Soviet Union was around now. Just imagine where we'd be. And he says that they were the ones training all the terrorists. And I guess he's trying to say the PLO and secular Marxist terrorists who would, they would hijack planes. It was definitely a dicey time. But he's trying to say they were the ones creating Al-Qaeda because all these Arab terrorists, I guess in his mind, were all kind of interchangeable. But in fact, he was the guy who, more than anyone else, was pushing for this grand architecture of jihad.
Is that the same clip where he sort of chides the woman interviewing him because he's like, if you phrase the question more intelligently, I could answer it more accurately. But when you use terms like bait, it just confuses things. And she just goes, "I'm quoting you directly," and he goes, "I never said bait. I never said we would bait." There's
an interview with a French magazine that he forever, once it got embarrassing, after 9/11, he said, "Oh, that's a very loose translation." But it's like the whole interview is just one long misquote. How did that happen? And then we found talking with people who are on the record or have done their own interviews with colleagues of Brzezinski that he in private he was saying that. I mean, whether or not he wants that to be recorded in an article is one thing, but he could never quite help himself telling people, "I did it. I lured them in. I baited the Russians into Afghanistan." And I guess it was a matter of public relations as to whether or not he was supposed to say that after 9/11. But he was insatiable.
And it's also a good illustration of kind of how policy in the late 1970s through the present kind of starts to form on a strategic level, really in the executive branch. Because Brzezinski sort of famously, like a lot of the CIA guys would like deny that there was any trap or something. They would say, "That's poppycock. We never heard of it." And the way that Brzezinski, he didn't need them to know about it. He kept things more siloed in particular, and was able to kind of influence policy from the top down in a way that I think with the kind of like people I think of Kissinger as sort of the ultimate freelancer or whatever, but I think Brzezinski actually probably deserves a fair bit of credit for helping to secretly start what would become ultimately like the largest such covert operation in the history of the CIA, probably the history of the government.
And would this be Operation Cyclone? Correct.
Absolutely, sir.
Okay, let's get into Operation Cyclone. This is essentially Charlie Wilson's war, right? I mean,
Yes.
this was our covert arming and backing.
Let's look it up real quick, y'all. Operation OPERATION Cyclone. CYCLONE. Excuse me. Okay. Operation Cyclone. How long is this? Oh, it's not too long. Let me read it. All right. Actually pretty long. I'll read it anyway. Operation Cyclone was the code name for the United States Central Intelligence Agency program to arm and finance the Afghan Mujahideen in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1992. Prior to and during the military intervention by the USSR in support of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, that is, the Mujahideen were also supported by Britain's M16, also conducted their own separate covert actions. The program leaned heavily, that is, toward supporting militant Islamic groups, including groups with jihadist ties that were favored in the regime of Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq in neighboring Pakistan, rather than other, less ideological Afghan resistance groups that had been fighting the Soviet-oriented Democratic Republic of Afghanistan administration since before the Soviet intervention. Operation Cyclone was one of the largest and most expensive covert CIA operations ever undertaken. Funding officially began with $695,000 in 1979, was increased dramatically to $20 to $30 billion per year in 1980, and rose to $630 million per year in 1987, as described as the, quote, biggest bequest to any third world insurgency, close quote. The first CIA-supported weapons were antique British Lee Enfield, that is, rifles, shipped out in 1979 of December, and by September 1986, the program included U.S. origin state-of-the-art weaponry, such as FIM-92 Stinger surface-to-air missile, some 2,300 of which were ultimately shipped to Afghanistan. Funding continued, albeit reduced, after the 1989 Soviet withdrawal, as the Mujahideen continued to battle the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan during the first Afghan Civil War. Interesting. We'll leave it there.
Backing of the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet army in Afghanistan. So, like, what describe like who was involved in Operation Cyclone and what did it actually entail?
At first, it was a much rougher, smaller, quick and dirty thing, and I think the idea that it started after the Soviet invasion is still present in a lot of vague historical memory. One of the things Brzezinski said in that interview we just cited was that no, I was doing that way before the invasion, at least a year before. but then even before that, the sources we tended to find were very insightful, really argue for almost a whole decade earlier, in the early 70s. Because what happened then, we won't go too into it now, but there was not a communist, but a kind of progressive revolution in which the monarchy was abolished in Afghanistan. And just like the British 100 years earlier, oftentimes that was like a progressive who wanted to develop his country more was not lining up with our designs or our friends' designs in the region. And so we already were working back then with guys like the Mujahideen, who we'll come to talk about, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Ahmad Shah Massoud, in the early 70s, not even the early 80s. So by the time you get to this turmoil going on with the communists fighting each other, and this guy Hafiz al-Amin, is he on the up and up? Either way, he's a psycho. He's killing everybody he can. The Soviets are very reluctant to go in, but because of the policy that is now definitely in motion in 78 and 79 of basically posing the problem: are we either going to let fundamentalist U.S.-backed Islamic militants take over, or are we going to let this dictator keep making this country more and more into a crackpot, failed revolution just south of our border? Or, and at the end this was a real consideration, is this dictator going to ally with the U.S. and the fundamentalists? So they kept saying no to troop requests, but eventually, on the bazillionth vote, they finally said, this is probably a big mistake, but we just don't have any better ideas. And that really is what American diplomats said they were hearing. And they say, with regret, that if we had pursued a more conciliatory policy, they don't really believe the Soviets would have invaded, which again is very different from Vietnam. And the two camps in the American government were known as the bleeders and the dealers. Brzezinski was a bleeder, and the dealers were guys like, guys in the State Department, one of whom was unfortunately assassinated in Afghanistan in a very weird and intrigue-laden plot of its own that you can hear in the show. But once that guy was dead, once Brzezinski had started to kind of, block out everyone else and had Carter's ear, Cyclone began to grow. And by the early 80s, Charlie Wilson had really been become a CIA asset as a congressman, because he was working with Gus Stavrokotos, the Greek guy, who had since upgraded everything, and they both wanted more guns, more mujahideen, and more money for all of this. So by the mid-80s, now the Soviets have for years been trying to get out. They tried to go to the UN. They've been putting out feelers for Pakistan, and the U.S. is telling everyone, don't negotiate. The Mujahideen don't negotiate, Pakistan don't negotiate, and so the stingers start arriving in 86 or something. Some people say that's the turning point. Either way, it's already been now half a decade that we've said, we're done when we say we're done. And so all of the BCCI transactions, all of the eventually legitimate, quote-unquote, congressional approvals, this stuff is turning the war into something that I don't think anyone, including Brzezinski, might have ever thought would be as destructive for the Soviets, but also for regular Afghan civilians. And by the end of the 80s, I think the American calculation was we've done our job, Leonard Nimoy style. My work here is done, and they beamed out.
Another American demon who figures largely in this story, a man who's caused a great deal of bleeding over the course of his career, is CIA Director Bill Casey. What was so fascinating about this guy is that he was a Knight of Malta, an extremely conservative Catholic, and do you think that there was something in his religious background that caused him to have a certain affinity with austere Sunni Islam?
I think honestly it was being a lawyer. I think that was it.
Really?
He was, I think it was being a corporate lawyer and then running the SEC, and then he was like, you know what we need to do? We need to get some Islamic-style operations in here. And I believe that was his takeaway.
Let's diversify our portfolio. But to your point, Steve Cole, who wrote a great book called Ghost Wars, although Ghost Wars interestingly says nothing about BCCI and some of these other things, so it's a slightly incomplete account, maybe more than slightly. But he writes about Casey, saying that Casey saw the Roman Catholicism he believed in and Judeo-Christian, or whatever you want to say, values, very much compatible with political Islam as a way to defeat communism. Because aren't we all basically on the same
Godless
side?
communism.
Yeah, exactly. And then now that's kind of a trope, or a bit of a joke to our generation, the idea. But he was very much about that, and it's more clubs. He was a Knight of Malta. Now you got the Safari Club. Anything where you had to call each other Prince or Your Highness to each other. He was really into. So it's no surprise he was really into this covert operation.
How would you describe his career?
Don't let that escape you, by the way. Make note of that. That's real, man. But I guess sometimes we gotta categorize. People gotta categorize themselves, what they gotta be categorized for society's sake. And to a certain extent, maybe you need to know. Well, hopefully, there's a way to sort of use the precise precision pathology to figure out who all the sociopaths and psychopaths are. Ones that intend on hurting other people. But it would appear that's not the case. So I think, again, I've seen the potential for wide-scale adaptation or usage of the precision pathology, but maybe it just hasn't gotten there yet. But I imagine it will. And, like I said, I think there could be a silver lining in a lot of different things. It's just my worldview. But in the interim, you just hope that, again, you don't apply let's manufacture a personality type or pathology based off of how we treat or deal with a person in the hopes of, taking them down that path to become the boogeyman or woman.
Career and his involvement in Cyclone, the BCCI. I mean, his fingerprints are all over all of this.
Yeah, I mean, Casey was basically Casey was really fucking old by the time of all this. He had been in the OSS in the 1940s and World War II. He was, really kind of like this, kind of canonical operations cowboy figure. And so when he came to the CIA, the idea was a bit of we want to get the agency to have its mojo back after the 1970s. But, and we go into this a bit in the show, a lot of what he was just doing, I would argue, at least from the way he saw it from his vantage point, was he was just trying to kick as much shit up as possible with the Soviet Union, to just try and knife them as many ways with as many tools as he had at his disposal. And so you have some pretty, arcane and crazy plots, and also Latin America was a major, place of interest for him. But so a lot of the plots like Iran-Contra, and the arming of the Mujahideen, which is a plot in its own right, they go back to, they are able to be as successful or unsuccessful. They take on the scale that both of those things achieved because Bill Casey was cheerleading, essentially.
If Brzezinski is the sort of cold and calculating architect of the policy, at least when it became a true, operation that was supposed to be sustained over years, then when he leaves, Carter gets obliterated by Reagan. Casey, still at the CIA, is the kind of giddy, inheritor of it, and he is, just sort of every day excited about new ways to train these guys in terror and to blow stuff up, bicycle bombs, and all these things. There were myths that the Soviets were using that are still reprinted, by the way. That the Soviets were dropping toys that were actually bombs, so they could literally kill children, which sounds. So it's one of those things that sounds a little too evil that you always have to check up on. But what was real was a lot of the new forms of terrorism being taught to the Afghans at the request of Bill Casey and Gustav Lakotos and of course Charlie Wilson. But he was also a character that's hard not to find goofy.
So let's make note there. Bill Casey was an important figure in training the Islamists to take that extreme sort of path. Interesting. Okay.
He was a mumbler, and no one could ever understand what the fuck he was saying. Reagan was apparently in some meeting.
Strategic.
Maybe it was because he could have just sort of working toward the
He was
mumbler.
Talking like Boomhauer, and they were just signing off.
Dang old
Stinger missiles.
dang old Islam, man.
Stinger, Mujahideen, Kabul, come on, man.
Like this, man. The dust in the wind, man. Or like a dang old candle in the wind, man. It don't matter, man. It's the oldies, old time. You know what I think, man? Like the dang old I think, therefore you are, man.
That's a wonderful way of putting it. Apparently Reagan was in a national security meeting at one point and passed a note to, I don't know, some cabinet minister, and after Casey had finished, and it read, Did you understand one goddamn word he said? So I mean, he was a character as all these guys are, but yeah, he was funneling and apparently using Catholic institutions to funnel anti-communist funds throughout his entire reign as CIA director. Not just with regard to Afghanistan. Iran-Contra, it's important. Close out on Casey. It's important to remember this whole season, Iran-Contra is happening as all this is happening. And the bad war, kind of like how Iraq was the bad war in the 2000s and Afghanistan was the right war, in the 80s, all the Democrats were basically against Iran-Contra. They thought it was gauche. They thought it was a little too evil, you know. But the other side of the policy was arming the Contras in Afghanistan, essentially. And that was a very popular cause select.
The good war.
The good
And
war.
and also there was in season 1 we talked about how another thing we did during that time was arm Saddam Hussein, and there were indictments and prosecutions handed down for that later on, but like much on a much they're just historically considered much smaller. But all of which is just to say that like throughout this period, from Colombia.
Now again, we're just using inference here to infer, and not necessarily making the connections, but we know the names: Saddam Hussein, George H.W. Bush, the father of George W. Bush, Bill Casey, creating the extreme responses by the Islamists. We're just putting asterisks next to ideas, not even creating real concepts out of it. We're just making little notes here and there. But I suspect if that I'm able to do this, and you are too, there are more complex and smarter people with complex systems at their disposal that can help, or rather use these connections to come to a conclusion using the same precise precision pathology. And then reassess some historical events and find out who did not have any sort of ties to it or had ties to it. I'll just say that.
Yeah, to Central America, to Afghanistan. I mean, you have just like I believe Mexican Condor is an operation. Operation Greenback, which is the DEA beginning money laundering. But like it's just you.
Now that one is interesting. I'm gonna make a note there. Greenback was in South Florida, and Greenback was a multi-jurisdictional, multi-agency effort that actually begun in the early 80s. Now here's the thing. When you think about the cocaine cowboy era, you say to yourself, man, was it like a decade sort of deal? Maybe a little bit longer, right? But really with the rules that they put in place in terms of the good guys, you had issues, because a lot of times the problems with the dope dealers, the dopers, if you will, in the South Florida drug industry complex, if you will, is not the dope, it's the money. How do you get rid of the money? Just by sheer size, weight, and paper, you dig? So they ran into that issue, and initially they found a little lane by using corrupt bankers and different individuals within the financial services industry that could help them get their bread back and then use it for other things, the laundering component. But with Operation Greenback, and I think a few legislative moves even before then, they pretty much shut down that whole thing. You feel me? And this was around the same time also where they had Noriega in check. He was still doing his thing, but I figured they knew that they was going to get him at some point. Now remember, H.W., George H.W. Bush, rest in peace. But it was around his timetable that he decided, we going to get, was it him or yeah, I think, it was him that got rid of Noriega. But, they really had shut down the whole joint. And so I say all of that to say, yo, could it have been possible that if you really think about it, it might have been a pre-crime sort of scenario, like Minority Report, or not there 100%, but leading to that place since like the 1980s, since something like Operation Greenback. Since that time, they've been able to see what's going where. And really, again, it's just a matter of, is it time yet to go after this kingpin, this queenpin? Has the time arrived? You know, maybe it's just been that strategic, and the whole time they've been fooling the other side, the bad guys, if you will, to think that they have some chance to, you know, do some dirt and come out victorious. It's just a theory, but make note, Operation Greenback, it was talked about in what's his name, Gerald Posner. Gerald Posner has a couple of books about South Florida, and one of them talks about Greenback real in depth and connects it to various cases. And I tell you, the way that, again, he makes these connections, if you use a little bit of inference to try to infer and connect plausible dots, you say to yourself, well, they had the game figured out in terms of, like, if it's chess, right? They had the game in check from that point on, because that was the only sort of gap, only sort of hole that can allow criminality to proliferate, to take place. The money, again, but once you set it up and you kind of block those places where the money can go, then what are they doing it for? What are they committing crimes for? You know what I mean? But anyway.
You've got like a really kind of, like the federal government was just doing a whole fucking lot in a whole lot of places. And Bill Casey, in a lot of ways, was like sort of the guy responsible for making sure that each of those endeavors could be as fully evolved a plot, Don DeLillo Libra style as it could be.
Yeah, his some of his underlings were like, well, what are we really working toward here? You know, this is, you know, not to say they weren't cold and calculating themselves, but they didn't find all this to be more than just kind of fun and games. But, you know, fun and games was Casey's, that was his deal. He loved it. He was giddy.
Well, I guess, like, I want to talk about, like, in a way to sort of understand emotionally or metaphorically the spread of covert fun and games and blowback across the entire face of the planet and indeed lower Manhattan. I want to talk about the brilliant trailer that you guys produced with Ben Clarkson for this season of Blowback, which was like this really, I mean, if you haven't watched the trailer, it's an animated trailer for season 4 of Blowback done by Ben Clarkson. Could you describe a little bit about, like, the concept of that trailer and, like, the idea that you were trying to communicate, and, like, in collaboration with Ben, and, like, to communicate in an artistic, emotional way, like, the themes of this season?
Yeah, it was very much a collaboration. I think Noah and I just had a call with him, and I said I wanted to treat this multi-limbed monster of drug money and bombs and instruments of terror, but also ideologies, as this one monster, to kind of give it this form, like The Thing is what I said. You know, something that's constantly changing to its surroundings and growing and squeezing into the corners it needs to squeeze it into, and then becoming something else all over again. And Ben loved that whole sort of organic idea. And so when he started to show us sketches and what people can see, if you guys want to throw a link in and they can see the trailer, he really took that idea that I just had a vague sense of, and he started to lay out this little story in which some kind of, you know, toxic element is being developed in a lab.
I would describe it like the metaphor, the visual metaphor here for covert action as Akira goop.
Sure.
The goop from Akira, you know, when he, like, blows up into a giant flesh blob.
And I think also it was a little bit inspired by, say, the sentiment in my favorite deleted scene ever, which is that deleted scene in Nixon, when he goes to see Richard Helms.
Right. Yeah. Played by Sam Waterston, whose eyes turned black.
Yeah, he really leaned in on that one.
Yeah.
But he's got his garden, and as they're mugging it up, there is a great line where he says something about how covert operations are organic. They grow, they change shape, and without ripping that off too much, I thought maybe not the form of a flower, but this kind of this thing that's alive, and he just did a fantastic job. Obviously, you guys have worked with him, but I couldn't be happier with. And I scored the trailer to complement Ben's visuals, and that was really fun, and it just turned out great.
I guess one of the best things about Blowback, or one of the best things about studying or learning about history, is discovering new guys.
Yeah.
Learning about guys is like most of what history is, and I've talked about a few of them that grabbed my attention in the first couple episodes. But just for you, Brendan and Noah, do you have a favorite guy from this season, or someone that you discovered that you weren't aware of before, or someone whose story particularly strikes you, or character or personality that you remember from this season?
Noah, do you want to take it first? I think I know mine.
Yeah, I think I really like Charlie Flynn. That's Michael Flynn's brother. So he comes in like the later part of the season. We don't get to spend too much time with them, unfortunately. But if you read Michael Hastings' book, The Operators, or his story about Stan McChrystal, Charlie Flynn just basically sounds like Michael Flynn 2.0. So like Charlie Flynn was Stan McChrystal's chief of staff, and he was just kind of the guy in charge of making sure that he was just kind of chief vibes officer. And I honestly just felt like he was the guy in this whole thing who I just wanted to know more and more about.
Well, the Flynn brothers, the Flynn brothers even being there now that we know what happened. It's like when you see that Giuliani was going to be offered mayor of Baghdad at one point, and you're like, now you're just it hits different, as they say.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Yes.
I would say mine is actually a guy named Kofor Black, and we've talked a lot about the 80s in this episode, which is good because I think people will listen to the show and they'll see us sort of crawl toward the 90s and then into the 2000s, and that's all in the show. But from the later half of the season, Kofor Black was the counter-terror chief for Bush, and he was this beefy bald guy who whether he was trying to look tougher than he was, or he was this big of a psycho, I don't know. But he wanted to literally put bin Laden's head on a stick. And he told his assistants who were on the ground, he's like, I want his head on a stick. And they're like, haha, yeah, but wait, are you serious? He's like, I want you to get pikes, and I want you to put it in ice so we can put it in a box, and I want to show the president. And so people ordered pikes and ice so that they could literally take bin Laden's head and put it in a box. Which of course they never got to do because for some reason he escaped from Tora Bora. But that guy was, but that guy. This is another great line. This is what I'll say. This is in Bob Woodward's book, and Bob Woodward has plenty of problems, but he does get some of the local color when you're in the White House. And there's a moment where he's talking to everybody and he's assuring them, like day after 9/11, don't worry, we're going to go out there, we're going to kill all of them. There's going to be we're going to have flies walking on their eyeballs, and that
by the end of the day.
By the end of the day, and Woodward writes that for the rest of the time anyone was there, his nickname around the office became the flies walking on the eyeballs guy, and
that's real punchy. That rolls off the tongue.
I mean, I guess so, but he was definitely a real character, and he's always the pugnacious guy in the room, especially compared to Colin Powell and Paul Wolfowitz.
Yeah. Also, it was a big surprise getting Ashraf Ghani's voice. That was my other favorite thing.
The last president of Afghanistan, I have to say, when I finally put a clip in, he's like Warwick Davis a little bit. It caught me off guard.
It would be funny if that the order to put bin Laden's head on ice and then put it on a pike and deliver it to the president. They never revised that when Obama got in. And someone presented a bungler with bin Laden's head.
Yeah. Well, I mean.
Thank you.
I'm making love to his body. What's in my mind?
His
head's on the desk.
Do I still have to tip if it took longer than 30 minutes?
Yeah, so but yeah, there was a lot of psychos and bizarre people. I mean, the Mujahideen themselves, people can listen to the show. I mean, there's kind of a flavor for every tendency you have. There were guys who were really smooth criminals who got PR treatment from the West. There were really nasty guys who kind of originated the idea of acid in the face of women. That was one of our main guys, and there were mentors to Osama. Several of them in the bunch. So. Yeah, it's hard to really pick, but that's why people need to dive in, and just check it out.
Well, like I said, we have covered basically just merely the tip of the iceberg of the history that you guys lay out on this season. The geopolitics of the heroin trade,
Yeah.
the American invasion of Afghanistan, and our subsequent withdrawal. But look, Brendan, no, I'm going to get you out here with an easy question, okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. 9/11. What really happened there? What's the real truth?
I knew you were going to say that. That is the season. There's a long.
Is there any more 9/11 truth that you guys have uncovered?
There's a little bit more truth that we found. We found a little
there's some
truth.
truth. There's some truth.
And yeah, just you have to sign up. But we found a lot of truth.
I guess we'll leave it there for today. Subscribe to Blowback to get the real 9/11 truth. That's the pitch we're going to leave you with. And before we close out today's show, I would like to...
So that's that. Listen, what I need you to do right now, if you're watching this, is go to Blowback. That's https / Blowback, B as in bubble, LOWBACK, blowback.show. Go there and check out this hot, dope vibe of a show that these dudes put together. But now you can subscribe to it. Apparently, as a whole podcast. I'm gonna get on board ASAP, but let's check out this quick trailer. Let me see. I think there's a bigger version. Excuse me. Or you can also check out blowback.supportingcast.fm. That's blowback.supportingcast.fm. All right. Let's see. This is the season 5 trailer. Fair use.
Here was the situation. They were sending great numbers of troops into Cambodia, preparing for what is called the Tet Offensive of that year. We take this action not for the purpose of expanding the war in Cambodia, but for the purpose of ending the war in Vietnam. I do it again. I do it again. I do it again. It's just a dead end. We're still fighting the Vietnam War, and if we have to use the Khmer Rouge as a pawn in that, we'll use them. I do it again. 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 I do it again.
Whoa. Yo, how dope is that? Wow. Hey, the algorithm wins once again. But now for $25 per year, or $25 for the whole year, you can subscribe to these gentlemen and their podcast. Blowback in season 5 is the most recent one. It was actually the story of Cambodia, Kissinger, and the Khmer Rouge. Will be available September 20th. Subscribers get 10 bonus episodes, ad-free listening experience, extra music and extended cuts from the show's soundtrack, unique discount codes for upcoming Blowback merchandise. And these are the apps that they're available on, all of the podcasts. You can pay here. And then available shows. Oh, we were talking more about this one. I don't think you can click on them though. Give them a gift. Frequently asked questions. But nah, reach out to the guys and show them some love. Let's see. So those are the 2 things I want you to do. But before we go, since they mention them, let's learn about Kofor Black real quick before we get up out of here. And by the way, I'm going to be live tomorrow night. And tomorrow night, we're going to be focused on the Sherman Antitrust Act. You see it, act like you want it. The Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act. I'll tell you here candidly, I think that the Sherman Antitrust Act is going to be able to help explain why everything that someone works on when it comes to the digital space fails, and how that isn't something just to brush aside. This thing might be heavier than we think, yo. But, again, rely on the laws of the United States of America before anything else. At least we still have that. And again, this will be brought to you by Hip Hop Legal / Hip Hop Lawyers. But tomorrow at 7 p.m., we're going to be learning about the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay? Now, before we go, let's learn about Kofor Black. Joseph Kofor Black, born 1950, an American former CIA officer who served as director of the Counterterrorism Center in the years surrounding the September 11th attacks, and was later appointed ambassador at large and coordinator for counterterrorism at the State Department by President George W. Bush, serving until his resignation in 2004. Prior to his roles combating terrorism, Black served across the globe in a variety of roles with the Directorate of Operations in the CIA. A native of Ridgefield, Connecticut, Black completed his BA at the University of Southern California, that is, in 1973. The next year, he earned a master's degree in international relations, also at USC. He was then accepted to a doctoral program at USC, but left in 1975 to join the CIA. CIA career up to 1999. At the CIA, Black trained for the clandestine services and volunteered for Africa, based on his knowledge of the region from childhood travels with his father across the continent. Initially, he worked as a case officer in Lusaka, Zambia, during the Rhodesian Bush War. He then transferred to Somalia, where he served for 2 years during the conflict between Ethiopians and Somalians. He worked in South Africa during the National Party government's war against guerrilla movements opposing the apartheid system. While assigned to Kinshasa, Zaire, Black was involved in the Reagan administration's covert action program to arm anti-communist guerrillas in the neighboring Angola. In 1993, Black transferred from London to Khartoum, Sudan, where he served as a CIA station chief until 1995. This was at a low point in his U.S.-Sudanese relations due to the latter's sponsorship of terrorism and the harboring of Carlos the Jackal and Al-Qaeda founder Osama bin Laden. Black oversaw the collection of intelligence, human intelligence that is, which is HUMINT, on terror cells and support structures. Towards the end of his tenure, he was targeted by Al-Qaeda for assassination. See Woodward, Bush at War, page 9. Black was also responsible for the collection of intelligence that led to the 1994 capture of the terrorist known as Carlos the Jackal. In 1995, Black was named the task force chief in the Near East and South Asia Division. From June 1998 through June 1999, he served as the deputy chief of the Latin American Division, director of CTC 1999 through 2002. In June 1999, Director of Central Intelligence George Tenet named Black director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. In his capacity, Black served as the CIA's director's special assistant for counterterrorism, as well as the National Intelligence Officer for Counterterrorism. Black's promotion was a part of Tenet's grand plan for dealing with Al-Qaeda. Black was the operational chief in charge of this effort. Tenet also put Richard, quote-unquote, on one of his own assistants, in charge of the CTC's bin Laden tracking unit. Black still headed the CTC at the time of the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center. Al-Qaeda Strategy 1999 through 2001. In December 1998, CIA Chief Tenet, quote-unquote, declared war on Osama bin Laden. Early in 1999, Tenet ordered the CTC to begin a baseline review of the CIA's operational strategy against bin Laden. In the spring, he demanded a new comprehensive plan of attack against bin Laden and his allies, close quote. The CTC had pronounced a, open quote, comprehensive plan of attack, close quote, against bin Laden and previewed the new strategy to senior CIA management by the end of July 1999. By mid-September, that is, it had been briefed to CIA operational level personnel, the NSA, the FBI, and other partners. The strategy was referred to as the plan, quote-unquote. Cofer Black and his new bin Laden unit wanted to project into Afghanistan to penetrate, quote-unquote, bin Laden's sanctuaries. They described their plan as military officers might. They sought to surround Afghanistan with secure covert bases for CIA operations, as many bases as they could arrange. Then they would mount operations from each of the platforms, trying to move inside Afghanistan and as close to bin Laden as they could to recruit agents and to attempt capture operations. Black wanted recruitments, and he wanted to develop commando or paramilitary strike teams made up of officers and men who could, quote-unquote, blend into the region's Muslim population. Parallel with these developments, in November through December of 1999, Muhammad Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, Zaid Jarrah, and Nawaf al-Hamzi visited Afghanistan, where they were selected for the, quote, plains operation, close quote, that was to become known as 9/11. Working with a Malaysian security unit, the CIA watched al-Hamzi and his companion Khalid al-Midhar as they attended a January 2000 Al-Qaeda conference in Kuala Lumpur, later determined to be where decisions about the, quote, plains operations, close quote, were made. According to an internal CIA report on the performance of the agency prior to the 9/11 attacks, Black was criticized for not informing the FBI that al-Hamzi and al-Midhar had subsequently entered the United States. In addition, the 9/11 Commission found that while Black testified before Congress's joint inquiry into 9/11, that the FBI had access to information on the two hijackers. The 9/11 Commission found no such evidence of this. The CIA increasingly concentrated its resources on counterterrorism, so that resources for this particular activity increased sharply. Some of the plans, more modest aspirations were translated into action. Intelligence collection efforts on bin Laden and Al-Qaeda increased significantly from 1999. Quote, by 9/11, close quote, said Tenet, quote, a map would show that these collection programs and human reporting networks were in place in such numbers as to nearly cover Afghanistan, close quote. During the summer of 2001, Tenet, Black, and one of Black's top assistants, Rich B, i.e. Richard, quote unquote, were active in conveying the dangers of Al-Qaeda to the new Bush administration. At a meeting with National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice and others on July 10, 2001, Rich, quote unquote, predicted a quote unquote spectacular terrorist attack against the U.S. interests, quote, in the coming weeks or months, close quote. Quote, multiple and simultaneous attacks are possible, close quote. After the meeting, quote, Rich and Cofer congratulated each other, close quote, feeling that at last the CIA had gotten the full attention of the administration. At an internal CIA update in late July, Rich, quote unquote, dramatically predicted, quote, they're coming here, close quote, i.e. the United States. One of the ways by which CIA or CTC surveilled Osama bin Laden in his Afghan base was the Predator reconnaissance drone, a joint CIA Air Force program of flights in autumn 2000, dubbed, quote, Afghan Eyes, close quote, produced probable sightings of the Al-Qaeda leader. Black became a quote-unquote vocal advocate of arming the aircraft with missiles to target bin Laden and other Al-Qaeda leaders. Throughout 2001, Black and Richard, quote-unquote, continued to press for Predators armed with adapted Hellfire anti-tank missiles. Legal and technical issues delayed the program. Black urged Tenet to promote the matter at the long-awaited cabinet level Principals Committee meeting on terrorism on September 4th, 2001. The CIA chief did so. The CIA was authorized to, quote, deploy the system with weapons-capable aircraft, close quote. September 11th, 2001. After the attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, some CTC staff refused an order to evacuate the CIA headquarters at Langley. This included the shift of the Global Response Center on the exposed 6th floor, which Black would eventually argue had, quote, a key function in a crisis like this, close quote. CIA Director Tenet finally accepted that Black wouldn't leave and that lives would be put at risk. The CTC obtained passenger lists from the planes and had been turned into weapons that morning, noting the presence of Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hamzi. This was the first quote-unquote absolute proof that the attacks were an Al-Qaeda plot. The CTC, had first come across the names in connection with potential terrorist activity in the winter of 1999 through 2000. Interesting. Post 9/11, global war on terror. On September 13th, 2001, Black briefed President George W. Bush in the White House Situation Room and outlined a CIA-led campaign in Afghanistan in which small teams of CIA officers in Green Berets would work with the Northern Alliance to topple the Taliban government and expel Al-Qaeda. Black told Bush, quote, "When we're through with them, they will have flies walking out across their eyeballs," close quote. Black told Bush that the CIA's planning efforts had put them in a better position to respond after the attacks. Tenet later said, "How could an intelligence community without a strategic plan tell the President of the United States just 4 days after 9/11 how to attack the Afghan sanctuary and operate against Al-Qaeda in 92 countries around the world? A war council, quote unquote, i.e. a restricted group of National Security Council, chaired by President Bush at Camp David, that is, was convened on September 15, 2001. Black was present. Tenet proposed first to send CIA teams into Afghanistan to collect intelligence and mount covert operations. The teams would act jointly with military special operations units. President Bush later praised the proposal, saying it had been a, quote, turning point in his thinking, close quote. Black and Armitage then flew to Moscow to seek help from Russian diplomatic and intelligence officers, as Afghanistan was in their sphere of influence. The Russians indicated their willingness to help and would not obstruct CIA activities. They warned Black about guerrilla fighters being a major problem for the Russian army in Afghanistan, and provided a team to the CIA to assist with extensive on-the-ground intelligence, especially about topography and caves. The CIA geared up to take the lead in the attack on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. The Northern Afghanistanian liaison team, led by Gary Schroen, that is, entered the country on September 26, 2001. A new branch was added to the CTC Special Operations, or CTC-SO. Hank Crumpton, the former head of CTC operations, was recalled to head it. Black told him, "Your mission is to find Al-Qaeda, target it, and destroy it," quote unquote. Testifying at the Congressional Joint Inquiry into the September 11th attacks in 2002, Black declined the offer of anonymity because, quote, "I want to look the American people in the eye," close quote. During the, quote, war on terror, close quote, Black is said to have played a, quote, leading role in many of the CIA's more controversial programs, including the rendition, kidnapping, and torture and interrogation of Al-Qaeda suspects, and the detention of some of them in secret prisons outside the USA. A small group of officials within the CIA's Counterterrorism Center was put in charge of supporting the prisons and managing the interrogations. By some accounts, Abu Zubaydah was taken into custody in March 2002 in Pakistan, and after initial U.S. interrogation and treatment for gunshot wounds, sent to a secret CIA torture center in Taliban, where he was waterboarded in April or May 2002. Coordination for counterterrorism. Black was appointed to the U.S. Department's the U.S. Department of State's Ambassador at Large for Counterterrorism in late 2002. He held this position until November 2004. Private sector work 2005 to present. Blackwater. From 2005 to 2008, Black was vice chairman of Blackwater USA, later renamed Blackwater Worldwide, then Z, and finally Academy, a U.S.-based private military contractor, which was, quote, the biggest of the State Department's 3 private security contractors, close quote. In March 2006, allegedly suggested at an international conference in Amman, Jordan, that Blackwater USA was ready to move towards providing security professionals up to brigade size for humanitarian efforts in low-intensity conflicts. Black denies the allegations. Critics have suggested this may be going too far in putting political decisions in the hands of privately owned corporations. The company denies this was ever said. Black resigned in 2008, reportedly after learning of illegal payments to Iraqi officials. Blackbird Technologies and Total Intelligence Solutions. From 2009 to 2014, Black joined Blackbird Technologies as Vice President for Global Operations. Blackbird was a technology contractor to intelligence, defense, and corporate clients before being acquired by Raytheon in 2014. Black later served as a chairman of Total Intelligence Solutions, Total Intel, a private intelligence gathering group. This company was created in February 2007 by the Prince Group, and the holding company that owns Blackwater. Total Intel was formed by the merger of the Black Group LLC, also led by Black, Terrorism Research Center Inc., the Technical Defense. As of 2021, Total Intel has been absorbed to OODA Group, that's OODA Group, and we know about the OODA Loop, but a business intelligence and crisis response consulting group. Black appears on the firm's list of consultants. Okay, we see some connections to Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, 2017, Burisma gas company stuff, Mueller intelligence investigation, Eric Prince. Let's see other roles. Director of publicly traded biotechnological company Northwest Biotherapeutics, NWBO. Awards. All right, that's that. So we learned about Cofer Black. We're going to close it out on that note. Yo, may the algorithm lead you down the path of greatness, positivity, and success. Cheers to life. You dig? Check us out tomorrow as we go live and talk about what? Now, we already learned about the Safari Club. We're going to learn about the Sherman Antitrust Act. You heard? Holla. Gia.